Are you tired of building projects that are as exciting as watching paint dry? You deserve to create something truly amazing. In this video, I'll teach you how to build an AI-themed landing page that's not just functional, it's mind-blowing. Every section will be packed with captivating animations and interactive elements that will leave visitors in awe. Today's digital world demands more than just functional websites. You need portfolio projects that demand attention, tell a story, and leave a lasting impression. But with countless design trends and coding frameworks, it can all feel overwhelming, leaving you frustrated and feeling stuck. The constant struggle of trying to create something great can feel exhausting. What if you could create a project that could accelerate your progress and set you apart from the competition? In this epic 4-hour tutorial, I'm going to take you on a journey from absolute scratch to building a jaw-dropping AI-themed landing page with impressive animations in every single section. In the hero section, we're going to create a next-level space effect with moving stars and parallax that makes this section feel like you're actually looking into space. In the logo ticker, we'll animate our logos so they seem to appear and disappear from the edges of the screen. In the product showcase, we'll create a glowing button border and interactive animated icons to give an extra element of surprise and delight. In our testimonials section, we'll create another endless scroll effect that gives the impression your site has a never-ending collection of great reviews. In the call to action section, we're going to be hiding an Easter egg. Not only does it look great, but when the user hovers this section, the glow will follow their mouse around the page. As you're building this incredible experience, not only will you be creating an asset for your portfolio or to help you get that job, you'll also be taking your knowledge to the next level. We'll be using the latest technologies that the top companies use, including React and Next.js for blazing fast performance, TailwindCSS to create styles quickly, and Framer Motion for mind-blowing animation flair. But on top of all that, I have something special I've never shown you how to do, creating animated icons using Lottie, the same tool used by companies like Duolingo, Disney, and Uber to create engaging animations that hold a user's attention. Now, if all this sounds too complicated, don't worry. I'll be with you every step of the way to make sure you understand exactly what's going on. Before we dive in, make sure you click the link in the description to download the video resource bundle to get you up and running. It includes not only the free Figma design and code starter template, but every image and icon exported and ready for you to use as you follow along. If you've already done that, let's get started. In order to get started, all we need to do is drag the folder that we downloaded, the code template, into our IDE. And then we need to run npm install, and that should allow us to install the dependencies, have our node modules, and make sure that we have everything we need to run this project. After this is installed, all we need to do is run npm dev, and that will allow us to see this in our browser. Now, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to go through our directory structure so that we understand how the project is set up. Now, this is a Next.js project that was created with Next.js, and so it has some of the folders that it automatically gives us by default. One of the things that it gives us by default is this app directory. This is using the app router. So we have the favicon, the globals.css, which was initialized with Tailwind. So it has the Tailwind base components and utilities brought in. And then within the layout.tsx, this is what's actually creating our page. So you can see that we're bringing in the inter font from the next/font/Google helper. We also have Tailwind merge as a utility. I'll dive into how this is used later, but essentially this is just merging together our Tailwind classes that we're going to be using for this build. We have a little bit of metadata that's being dropped into the page, and then we have our root layout, which defines our HTML, our body, and of course, everything that goes within that. Now, Tailwind merge is being used right now to concatenate the inter class name, or the class name that's going to drop the inter font onto our page, with the base styles that we're giving the body. So you can see that automatically we're going ahead and setting the body background to black. We're setting the text to white automatically, and we're also adding this anti-alias rule that just makes the page match the design much better as far as font weight. From there, let's go into our page.tsx. This is where we're going to be bringing in all of our sections, but for now, all we wanted to do was return hello world so that we knew that this page.tsx was actually getting onto the page. Into our other folders, we have our assets directory. This is going to include all of our images, all of our icons that we need for this project. So those will all be located here. And then inside of our sections, we have each of our sections that are right now broken out. Now they don't return anything yet. So you can see we're going to be starting with the header.tsx file, but right now it just returns a header section text. So we're going to be filling in all of the code that's going to make this project work inside of each of these sections, bringing them together inside of our page.tsx. I'll show you how we're doing that just here in a second. And that's how this is all going to come together to be able to create an amazing landing page. Let me talk about a couple more things that we've done that are different than the default as we move throughout this directory structure. So one of those things is our Tailwind config. So this isn't exactly set up how Next.js would have it. We actually did a couple of things. We removed a couple of things. We added a couple of things that are going to make it more accurate to our design. So the first thing is we updated our container rule. So normally this doesn't have this many items inside of it for configuration, but we did add center true to make sure that we were centering our container every time. And we updated our padding to be 20 pixels on the small screen size and 80 pixels at the large screen size. We also updated the screens and our breakpoints for these screens. So we will have a 375, a 768, and a 1200 pixel screen sizes for a container. That's just going to make sure that we are matching our design more closely and can more easily understand what's going on there. And then for our screen sizes, we also updated those so that we weren't adding in extra screens. So we defined every time we say screen small, we're going to be referring to the 375. Screen medium is going to go 768, and of course screen large is going to go to 1200. So those screen sizes are defined individually, and that's about all we've done with our Tailwind config. Now right now you can see that we only brought in the app and sections directories. Those are the only ones right now that we're planning on writing TSX or Tailwind classes in. So those are really the only ones that we need inside of this content array. One of the other things that we did is we updated our next config to be a little bit different as well. So we updated this to be able to use the SVGR library, which is going to just make it a little bit easier for us to bring in SVGs as components instead of having to bring them in as code. So that's all this does, straight from the SVGR documentation. So it's exactly how they would recommend that we set this up. They had a specific one for a Next.js project. Of course, this is a Next.js project, so that makes it very easy for us to get started. Without further ado, let's hop over into sections, open up our header.tsx, and all we really want to do is go ahead and make sure that this comes onto our page. So we're going to go into the app directory under page.tsx. We're going to import that section. So I'm going to import my header from @/sections/header, and then we're going to drop this into our home page. So instead of returning h1 hello world, we're going to return the header component. As soon as we save this, hopefully we'll see that it shows header section over here on the right, which indeed we do. And that means that our header section is now tied into our page, which means we can go into header.tsx and we can start making updates here. Let's go ahead and take a look at our design. So the first thing we're going to look at is the mobile design. And as you can see on the mobile design, we're seeing a little bit of a border on the bottom. We're seeing our logo on the left that's surrounded by some sort of a box. And we also have a button and a menu icon on the right. Now the button is an interesting one because it has a lot of styles applied. It has some sort of shadow, it has an inner gradient, it has some border effects applied, and it looks like it's glowing. That's going to be a fun one to build, and it's probably going to be a little complex, so we'll dive into exactly how to do that. But that looks like the main complexity of our header right now. As we move on into the tablet design, we can see that we start to confine the navigation to the center of the page, and we bring in our actual menu. So the menu icon disappears, and then we have our actual menu on the tablet size. And then as we move into the desktop, we see that the header section is the same size as far as the same width, and we're not seeing it really change. So we're just gonna have to make sure that it's centered on the screen. And of course, we're going to want to ensure that it is also sticky to the top so that as we scroll down, we have it covering the content of the page and showing that great blurred effect through the background. So we'll make sure we handle that as well. It's not shown here in the design, but that's what we'll make sure and do. Without further ado, let's go ahead and dive into the code and start building this header section. Now that we've taken a look at the design, let's go ahead and dive into the code for our header. The first thing I want to do is go ahead and wrap this in a semantic header tag. So I'm going to add that header tag here. And then within that, we know that we're going to have a container. So I'm going to go ahead and put our div class name equals container within that. Within that, we're going to have a logo on the left and a button and a menu icon on the right. So I'm going to wrap those two things in a div, and then I'm going to create a div for each one of those. So I'm going to have that for my logo and this for my button. Inside here, I know that I'm going to have my logo. So I'm just going to go ahead for now and put a little placeholder of the word logo. And then over here, I'm going to have my button. So I'm going to put a semantic button tag for that. I'm going to make sure it has the right text of join waitlist. And then we know that there's going to be an icon here for the menu. So I'm just going to put a little span tag with the word menu right there. Inside of here, I'm going to go ahead and put a span tag here, wrap this in a span tag as well. That'll just make sure that we have the right text there. Now that we have the content for our header section, at least our mobile header section on the page, let's go ahead and start to create some of the styles that'll make this work. So the first thing I'm going to do is make sure that these are flexed left and right. So I'm going to say class name equals flex. That'll flex them left and right. And we want them justified between with the justify content space between rule. Next to that, we also want there to be a little bit of padding on the top and bottom of this. So I think in this case, we're actually going to put this on the header. Let me go ahead with the class name of PY4. That should ensure that we have the right padding top and bottom there. And we do want to go ahead and bring in our icons as well. So we have a couple of icons. The first one is going to be our logo icon. So I'm going to import my logo icon from @/assets/logo.svg. Now we can import icons this way because we're using SVGR. That enables us to use icons, SVG icons, as React components. So I'm just going to go ahead and replace my logo span with this logo icon, and that should drop the logo on the page. Now, right now, it doesn't have a color, I don't believe. Let me go ahead and set some things on it and see what we can do to make it actually show up. So let me go ahead and make sure that it's the right height and width. So I'm going to say H8, W8. That should make it 32 by 32. And there it shows up on the page. That is perfect. We also know that we're going to be bringing in our menu icon. So I'm going to go ahead and import my menu icon from @/assets/icon menu.svg, and then we're going to replace this span tag with our menu icon, and that should also ensure that it shows up on the page. Now that makes it obvious that we need to make sure that this div is flexed as well so that these are aligned left and right. So I'm going to say class name equals flex on this div. And we want to style up a couple more things here. We want to make sure that it has the right gap. So I believe that should be a gap of 4. We'll also make sure that the items are aligned center with items center. Now that's looking pretty good so far. There's a couple of other things we can take care of without much trouble. One of them is the border bottom. So we can go ahead and apply this here. We're going to say border B for border bottom 1 pixel. And then we'll make sure that it's also the right color. It looks like that color is going to be white 15. So we're going to say border white/15. And that's going to give it white with a 15% opacity. Just gives it that little touch that really allows it to ensure that our site just looks so clean. So that is going to be helpful for us there. We also want to make sure that our border is around our logo. So I'm going to wrap this in another div, and I'm going to ensure that that div has a border as well. Class name of border, and that should put a border around that. And then we're going to make sure that it has the right style. So we want this to be 40 by 40. So H10 width 10 should do that. We also want to make sure that it's rounded. So we'll put rounded large. And then to make sure that the logo is actually showing up in the center, we can do an inline flex rule with this. So I'm going to say inline flex and then justify to the center. We're going to put our Y axis centering as well with items center. And then we also want to make sure that the border is the right color. So this is going to be border white 15 as well. And that should ensure that our border is the right color. Now that we're done with everything else in the header on the mobile view, that means we need to take care of our button. Our button is going to be pretty complex. So the first thing that we're going to want to do is make sure that it has the proper just general styles. So we're going to go ahead and give it a class name, and we're just going to go ahead and say border for a border placeholder so we can see where that's at. We're going to say py2 to give it 8 pixels of padding on the top and bottom, px3 to give it 12 pixels of padding on the left and the right. And we also want to make sure that it is rounded. So we'll say rounded large to give it that 8 pixels of border radius. Now it's the right size. We also want to ensure that the font is the right weight. So we'll say font medium. I'm seeing that the text is a little smaller than this, so I'm going to say text small to give it that 14 pixels of font size and 20 pixels of line height, and that ensures that it's the right size. Now comes the actual coloring, which is of course going to be the hard part. The first thing that it has is it has a linear gradient from top to bottom. So let's go ahead and add that in. Now we can use TailwindCSS's rules to ensure that this works. So we can say gradient bg gradient to bottom, and that should ensure that the linear gradient is added there. And then we can just add custom colors. So we can say from and add a custom color there, and we can say to and add a custom color there. So the first color is going to be a hex code of 190D2E, and the second color that it's going to is going to be a hex code of 4A208A. That should add the correct hex codes there. The next thing we'll ensure is that it has the proper shadow as well. So it doesn't just have a linear gradient on the button, it also has a shadow as well. So let's go ahead and add that in. We'll go ahead and add a shadow, and we're going to make a custom rule here. It looks like it's going to be 0 pixels, 12 pixels of spread. So let's add 12 pixels there. And then this is a hex code as well. And that hex code is going to be 8C45FF. And that should add the right shadow there. Now, we do have a border here, but the border is going to be a problem for us because the border is actually done with a linear gradient. We can't really do in CSS linear gradient borders, so we're going to need to remove our border here to allow for us to have some space to add our border inside the actual button itself. We're also going to want to set this button to relative, so I'm going to put the relative class here so that we can put absolutely positioned elements within the button, and we'll go ahead and wrap our button text in a span as well. That'll ensure that we have some differentiation between the items that we're putting within the button and the items that we're actually just using to style the button itself. Within the button, let's go ahead and create another div, and this is going to be a div that sits within the button just to style it. So we're going to give it a class name of absolute. We're going to say inset 0. This is essentially just going to make sure that we have it to top, bottom, left, and right 0. And we're going to give it a border as well. That will ensure that we have it in the right space. We want it to mimic the button styles themselves. So we're going to go ahead and say rounded large. That's going to give it that border that we want, but we can't use this border right here because once again, we're dealing with the linear gradient border. So we're going to have to remove this actual border here, and we're going to drop one inside that's going to be absolutely positioned. So this is going to be a div here. This is going to be the start of our border coming from the top. So what we're going to do to create this is go ahead and add a class name, and we're going to set the border here. This border is going to be border white with 20% opacity. And it's also going to be absolute, and we're going to make sure that it is inset 0, so that makes sure it covers the button. So let's see how that looks once we add that in. Okay, so that's the whole thing. Now, in order to transition it from a top color to a bottom color, what we can do is we can use a mask image. A mask image allows us to fade things out and fade things in. So we can have a mask image of a linear gradient that ensures that we're showing 100% of this border on the top and then 0% of this color on the bottom. That's going to allow us to do our fade. So we're going to add a custom rule of mask image, and then we're going to say linear gradient, and that's going to go to bottom, and it's going to go from black to transparent. And that's going to ensure that we have what we were just talking about, where we go from 100% of this color to whatever our next color is going to be. Now, in order to create that bottom part of that border, what we'll do is we'll go ahead and add another absolute position element, and we're going to say div class name equals border. And let's go ahead and see where this is showing up. Okay, so this is going to be absolutely positioned. It's going to be inset 0 as well. So that's the height and width of our button. And this is going to be the bottom color. So whatever that bottom color is, looks like that is border white 40. So border white with 40% opacity. And we're going to use another mask image to ensure that it doesn't show up on the top, but it does show up on the bottom. So I'm going to say mask image, and this is going to be another linear gradient. And instead of going to the bottom this time, we're going to say to top, black, transparent. And that's going to make sure that it only shows up on the bottom. And then as it transitions to the top, it's going to go to the other linear gradient on the top. So let me go ahead and change this. Wasn't spelled correctly. Gradient should be that. And that takes it from our 40% opacity white to our 20% opacity white by fading this one out to the top and fading this one out to the bottom. So that looks good. Now we just need to add a little bit of border radius. So both of these are going to say rounded large, and that's going to add the border radius that we need. Another thing that's present in this button is the inset shadow. So let's go ahead and add another layer to create our inset shadow. So I'm going to say div class name again of absolute inset 0, and this is going to hold our shadow, and then we're going to add a custom shadow on this. So I'm going to say shadow, and then we're going to add a custom value of 0, 0. So it's not going to change in the left or right direction. It's going to be 10 pixels of blur, and then it's going to have a color of RGB 14069255, and then 0.7, that's going to give it that 70% opacity that it needs. And then it's also going to be inset. So that should be on the inside of that. We're also going to need to make sure that this has the same amount of border radius as our last ones did to ensure that it doesn't show up with square borders here. So I'm going to say rounded large, and that should hopefully take care of that. Now we're really starting to see this glowing effect come alive. This looks really good where it's at. It matches our design. I really like what's happening with that. So without further ado, let's take a look at what it looks like on tablet and desktop and ensure that we're setting the right styles for those screen sizes as well. So I'm going to go ahead and open up my Polypane browser a little bit here, and I'm going to switch over to the tablet view and see what we see. So I'm going to slide out my Polypane browser so we can get a little bit better view. I'm going to switch over to the tablet view and see what we can see. And right now we see that, first of all, our navigation menu, our header is way too wide because we know at the tablet view it's going to be constrained. So let's ensure that we set the right styles here. And of course, we're also going to want to start showing the menu items at this size. So let's do both of those things. The first thing I want to do is add in my content. So we know that we're going to need a third div here. So I'm going to set that div, and that's going to be a navigation, a semantic nav tag, and we're going to have our 4 nav items. Each of those are going to be a link. So I'm going to say a href equals to set those as links and make sure there are 4 of those. And then we're going to have our features. We're going to have developers. We're going to have the pricing navigation item, and we're going to have the changelog navigation item. We are going to want to make sure that these are all styled appropriately. We know that we have flex justify between here, but we want all of our items to be aligned center. So I'm going to say items center, and that should push those down towards the center. We want to put gap between these as well. So I'm going to go ahead and create a flex on this as well. So I'm going to say class name equals flex, and we're going to say gap is going to be 8. That's going to give it the 32 pixels of spacing that we need between each of our items. We also have 70% opacity on these by default. So I'm going to say text white /70. And then when they get hovered, we're going to transition those to text white. So we're going to say hover text white. That's going to make sure that they're white, fully white when they're hovered. And then we're going to add transition. That's just going to add a little bit of transition between our white and our 70% opacity white so that those happen effectively. So let's see how that looks. And we can see that's actually happening all at once. We want each individual one to be transitioned. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to remove this right here, and we're going to put each of these on each of the A tags. So I'm going to go ahead and select all of those together. I'm going to say class name equals, and then go ahead and put my text white 70, hover to text white, and transition on there. As soon as I save that, let's test this out again. And we do see that that looks like it's working as it should. The other difference that I'm noticing from the design is that we have a border bottom, but at this size, we're going to start wrapping this in just a single border around the entire header. So instead of just having this border bottom, we don't want this to show up anymore. So up here, we're going to say, as soon as it gets to the medium size, let's say border none. After that, we need something that's inside of our container that can actually hold our border. I think we can just use this flexed container that we have right here. Let's go ahead and add a border to it and see how it looks. And yes, we do see that that looks good. We need to change a couple of the styles around to make sure that this works well though. So I'm going to say that my border is going to be white 15. So I'm going to say border white with 15% opacity with border white /15. We also want to make sure that it has padding there. So I'm going to say my padding is going to be 10 pixels or 2.5 in Tailwind terminology. And we want to make sure that the border radius is set appropriately as well with rounded XL, and that should set the border radius that we need. Let's go ahead and see if we can open this up a little bit more so that we can see this at full size. So that's 100% right there. That helps us see that border a little bit better. Another difference I'm seeing in the design is that we're no longer should be showing our hamburger icon as well. So I'm going to go ahead and come down here, give it a class name of medium hidden, and that should ensure that we're not showing this on this screen size. I'm also noticing a difference in the total size of this navigation in the tablet version versus what I'm seeing in the design. And that's because we don't have a max width appropriately set on this. So I'm going to come back up here to my flex container and make sure that it has a max width 2XL. That should set a max width of 672, which I believe is what we're trying to achieve. And then I'm going to say MX Auto, and that should also ensure that it stays towards the center of the page. There's only one more difference that I can see at the screen size right offhand, and that is going to be that our text, our navigation items are a little big. So I'm going to say text small right here, and that's going to bring them down to the proper size. So that's looking good. Let's go over to the desktop size and see if we can make this look great as well. So the view that we're seeing right now is 65%. Let's see if we can go ahead and close this down, get our code showing, and then pull out our desktop a little bit more so that we can actually see this in full size. Now at the desktop size, we can see that nothing really changes here. So that means that we can go back to our mobile size and just ensure that we didn't break anything with our responsive styles. And indeed, it looks like we have broken a couple of things because we forgot to add responsive rules for a couple of things that we added. So the first thing we're going to make sure is that we do have this div, this navigation not showing until we get to the medium size. So what we're going to do is we're going to say class name equals, we're going to say hidden, and then we'll say medium block, and that will ensure that we show that on the medium size, but we're not showing that on the small size. We also don't have any border around this at this size either. So we're going to come up here and say medium border. That's going to make sure that we don't have the border there that we don't want. And we're also going to ensure that we don't have any padding, extra padding here until we get to the medium size either. So I'm going to say medium padding 2.5. That should make sure that we have the padding there that we need when the time comes. I think this takes care of the header. I'll go one more time through all of my panes by going ahead and opening my Polypane browser over here. And I'm going to go to the horizontal view and ensure that we see everything on every screen size as we should. So mobile looks great. The tablet is looking good as well. And as we get over to desktop, it's centered on the screen. It's the right size. It looks great. I'm really happy with how this is going so far. Now that we've taken care of our header section, let's start to look at our hero. Our hero has a lot of complexity in this particular design. So we can see that it has some content, but what's behind the content is what's going to be pretty complex. So we have a circle that we're going to put in the center. We're going to add a gradient that's going to make it look like there's a bit of light that's going to be shining on that circle. We can also see that there are these rings that we're going to be adding around the circle as well. So we're going to be talking about how we're going to do that. And then we see that there are also stars in the background. So there's a lot of different things, different styles that we're going to have to bring into even just the mobile section of this to really make this work. As we move into the tablet, nothing really changes. It's just the sizing of everything changes. So we're going to have bigger text. We're going to have a bigger planet. We're going to have bigger rings. And then of course, we're also still going to have our stars in the background. And as we move to desktop, the same is pretty true. We're going to have, another ring that we can see on this particular size. We're going to have our stars. Everything's going to look good there. Now there's going to be a lot of complexity and code here. So without further ado, let's go ahead and dive into the code. Let's dive into the hero section. What I'm going to do is go ahead and into our sections folder, and I'm going to open up hero.tsx. You can see this is returning hero section right now. So let's go ahead and import this into our page. Let's go into source/app/page.tsx and import this section with import hero from @section/hero. And then I'm going to ensure that it's below this header. So I'm going to say hero here, and that should put it below the header. Now React doesn't like this because JSX can only have one root element. So we can put a React fragment very easily just by adding our opening and closing brackets there, and the same thing at the end. That will wrap it in this React fragment and ensure that React can actually render our homepage like it needs to. Now that we have the hero section in there, what you can see is we now have the text hero section over here, which means that we have a connection to our page.tsx. So I'm just going to close that out and we'll work on our hero code. The first thing I always like to get in here is the actual text content of the section, what the bot crawlers actually see as they enter this section. So I'm going to say section, a semantic section tag here instead of my div. And inside that section, we always have our container. So I'm going to say div class name equals container just to hold in all of our section contents. Inside that container, we're going to have a title, a description, and a button. So for the title, this is actually going to be the title for the page. So I'm going to use a semantic h1 tag. I'm going to say AISEO for the title. And then for my description, I'm going to use a semantic paragraph tag. And then I'm just going to copy and paste the text from the design. So we have elevate your site's visibility effortlessly with AI, where smart technology meets user-friendly tools. And then as you can see, we also have a button under our description. So we're going to need to add a button tag here, and that's going to say join waitlist. Now, the interesting thing about this button is it looks very similar to the button that we already used inside of our header section. What if instead of copying and pasting those styles, we could use a component to encapsulate those styles and ensure that we could move them from one place to another and just change them in one place, and keeping our code very dry and looking very nice. So what I'm going to do that is I'm going to go ahead and create a components folder. So I'm going to say new folder here. I'm going to say components, and then inside that components folder, I'm going to go ahead and create a button.tsx file. That should allow us to encapsulate our button component within this button.tsx file. And all I'm going to do is go into my header.tsx. I'm going to grab where my button was, and I'm just going to go ahead and copy this entire button. Come back to my button.tsx, and I'm going to paste it, but first I'm going to wrap it in a component wrapper. So I'm going to say const button equals, and it's going to have a function that takes in some props up here, and then we're going to return our JSX that we already created. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. And really the only thing that we want to be able to change via props is the text of our button. Now this doesn't even change, but of course we're not going to create a component without giving any options to the user. So what I'm going to do up here is just go ahead and make sure that we have props coming in here, and then our props.children is what we're going to drop right in here. So I'm going to say props.children, and that should do the trick. Now it doesn't know what props we can give it, so I'm going to say react.props with children, and that should give it the proper type that will allow us to use this props.children. Now that we've done that, one of the other things that we're going to have to do, now that we've created a new folder, we have some TailwindCSS in here, is we need to tell TailwindCSS to now process this folder as well. Otherwise, it won't process these styles. So in order to show what that looks like, I'm actually going to just go ahead and ignore that part for now, drop our button on the page, and then we'll see what it looks like before TailwindCSS is processing it, and then afterwards. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. So we have this here. I'm going to come into my header section. I'm going to remove this button and import my component. So I'm just going to go ahead and delete that there, come up to the top of the file and import my button. So I'm going to import button. Now right now we actually didn't export the button. I just realized that. Let's come back to a button. Let's go ahead and export const of button. There we go. So now that makes it exportable so we can bring it into other files or import it. So now I'm going to import my button from @/component/button, and then down here we'll just go ahead and place it in there. So I'm going to say button here, and that should place my button in there. And I'm going to want to add in the text. So I'm going to say join wait list here, and that'll allow the text to be added. Now, interestingly enough, we are seeing it styled accurately, even though it's in a folder that TailwindCSS isn't covering. And I think that's because we would need to restart or kill off our Next.js cache in order to not see that show up. So I'm going to open up my terminal with this button down here. I'm going to actually kill off my Next.js server with Control-C on a Mac, and then I'm going to say npm run dev, and let's see what actually happens when we run this again. And yes, as you can see, now our button is not styled like we wanted it to be, and that's because this is not covered yet by our Next.js config. So I'm going to close this out for a second. By closing that down, I'm going to come down into my Tailwind config. I'm going to ensure that we're also covering the components folder. So I'm going to copy and paste this right underneath. I'm going to say source/components, and essentially */* with these file extensions ensures that we have any file within that components folder, and with these extensions that will be covered by TailwindCSS. It's now going to be looking at this content when it compiles. So if I save that, now we have our button styled appropriately. Like you can see right here, we have a button component we can now use, and I can drop that into my hero.tsx. So let's close everything out that we just did. Let's close out our Tailwind config, close out our header. We don't need that anymore. We did that appropriately. Let's close out our button component, and let's go ahead and bring in our button component into our hero. So I'm going to say import button from @/component/button, and then we'll pull that right into here with button and then join waitlist. And that should ensure that it's styled appropriately. As soon as I hit save, you can see that we carried all of those styles without having to recreate them just by using our component. Now we know that most of the background of this particular section is going to be absolutely positioned because there's just not really going to be a better way to do this. So let's first ensure that our content is styled as it should be, and then we'll worry about all of those background elements on the page. So inside of my container, I have my H1 for AI SEO. We know that it's going to be a very large text size. So I'm going to say class name here. I say text 8XL. That should be the right text size. We also want to make sure it's the right font weight. So that's going to be font semi-bold. We're going to bring it in with tracking tighter. That's going to make sure that the letter spacing is going to be -5%. We also have the text that's actually colored. So it almost looks like the light is shining on the text as well. And in order to create that effect, what we'll do is we'll add a radial gradient to the text itself. So what we'll do is we'll go ahead and give a background to our H1, and then we'll just make sure that that gets clipped to the text. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say BG and give this a custom radial gradient, and that radial gradient is going to be 100% at top left, and it's going to go from white to white at 50%, and then to our RGB of 74, 32, 138, and then it's going to be 50% opacity. So that will take care of that. Let's see what that looks like real quick. And this is so you can see the actual gradient that's going to be showing up here. The other thing is, since we have this 50% opacity, we don't really want it blurring out to black. So what we're going to do is we're going to add another background color of white, and that's going to ensure that the opacity is showing up over white, which just should make sure it's the right color. Now that we've done that, the way that we can clip that to the text is we'll make our text transparent by using our text transparent rule to give it the color of transparent, and then we'll say BG clip text, and that should give it a background clip value of text, and that actually contains that to the text itself. We're also going to want this text to be in the center of the screen, so I'm just going to say text center, and that should give it a text align of center. Coming down to our paragraph, let's scoot back over here, and let's go ahead and give this a class as well. So I'm going to say class name, and this is going to be text large. So I'm going to say text large to give it that 18 pixels of font size. We also want this to be 70% opacity. So I'm going to say text white /70. That should give it the 70% of opacity that we need. And we're also going to make sure that it's pushed down from our title. So I'm going to say MT5 to give it the 20 pixels of spacing or margin top. And I also want this to be centered. So I'm going to say that we have text center. That should make sure that it's also centered on the screen. Our button is going to be a little bit different. We don't have to do anything else with the styles because we've already taken care of that, but we do want to put it in a container so that we can style it and push it away from our description as well. So I'm going to wrap that in a div. I'm going to give it a class name of flex, and we're just going to justify it to the center with justify center. We'll also give it some margin. So I'm going to say MT5 here as well. That should give it the proper margin that we need. Now that we've done all that, we need to make sure that this section is the right height. And it looks like at the mobile view, this section should be 492 pixels tall. So let me go ahead and just do that. And the reason we want to do that is because we have a lot of absolutely positioned elements. So we want to go ahead and ensure that our section stays the right height so that we can position those things really accurately within this section, because we have a lot of things that are working together. So I'm going to say class name, and we're going to say H, and we're just going to give it a custom value of 492 pixels. That ensures that we have it at the right height. And we also want to ensure that our content is in the center of this section. So what we can do is we can just say flex, and we can say items center. That should ensure that our content stays in the center of this section. Now we start getting to the fun part where we start layering our backgrounds on top of each other, and we start ensuring that we have the right things showing. We know that we're going to have a planet, we know that we're going to have stars, and we know that we're going to have rings. So let's see how we're going to do each of those things. The first thing I'm going to bring in is my stars. So I'm going to import my stars BG from my @/assets/stars.png. That should allow me to use those stars. Let's see if we can just put this as a background on this section tag. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a style tag, and in that style tag, I'm going to give it a background image, and that's going to be my URL of starsbg.src. Now you can see that I used a JavaScript interpolation in order to stick a JavaScript variable inside of a string using these backticks. So these aren't regular ticks, these are backticks. And then I'm sticking my starsbg.source. That's what I get from importing that. And that should allow me to put my starsbg source inside of my URL. So if I save that, we should be able to see that that shows up. By default, all of my background images will always repeat left and right and top to bottom. So they're always going to be repeated in both of those directions. Now that we have our stars, let's see if we can go ahead and create our planet. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a div inside of our section right here, div class name. And this is going to be absolutely positioned. So everything inside this div is going to be layered on top of our section. So let's see if we can go ahead and create our planet. So I'm going to put this planet inside of our section right at the start so that we can position it absolutely and then have the text overlay it. So I'm going to say div class name equals absolute, and this is going to have a height of 256 pixels, also a width of 56 pixels at the mobile size. And for now, we're just going to say BG purple 500. That'll go ahead and just give it the purple color so we can see it. We want this to be rounded, so we'll say rounded full. That should give it the border radius that we need. And we want to give it a border as well. So we're going to say border and border white /30. That should give it the border with a 30% opacity on that as well. In order to get it to the right position, what we're going to do is we're going to say that it's going to be top 1/2. That's going to be 50% from the top. We're going to say left 1/2. That's going to be 50% from the left. And then we're going to use a transform rule to pull it back half of the actual size of the planet itself. So since it has a static size, we could say, negative top 32 and then negative left 32. But in this case, we'll just go ahead and use a 1/2 as well. So I'm going to say negative translate X, and instead of 0, I'm going to say 1/2, and then negative translate Y 1/2, and that should pull it right to the position that we want it to be in. In order to get our content to show up on top of this absolutely positioned element now, all we need to do is tell our content to be relative. That should stick it on top. So let's go ahead and give this a relative class, and that does indeed stick it on top of our planet. Now for this planet, we're going to have a pretty complex background in order to make it look like there's light shining on it. It's going to be a radial gradient. So stick with me on this one. Let's go ahead and give it this radial gradient that we'll need. So we're going to come to the end of our translates that we've done on our planet, and we're going to say BG, and we're going to give a custom value of radial gradient. Now that gradient is going to be 50%. 50%, that's the position. So it's going to be basically in the center at 16.8% and 18.3%. And then we're going to give it color. So the first one is going to be from white, and then we're going to go from white to an RGB value of 184 and then 148, 255. And that's going to be at a percentage of 37.7. And let's see what that looks like so far, just to ensure that we're showing this as we should be. Okay, and you can already see that there's some light kind of starting to show here. So let's continue to go on with our next color value here. The next color value is going to be RGB, and it's going to be 24,066. And this is going to be at 100%, so we don't even need to put our 100% there. And it looks like we may have made a small mistake with this over here. So let me ensure that we have our radial gradient wrapping all of the colors like we should be. And there we can see that we actually do see our planet showing up. Now, as I look at my design versus what I'm seeing on the screen right now, it looks like my border is actually a little bit too white. So I'm going to drop that down to my 20%. That actually matches closer to what we have on the design. We also can see that there's going to be a pretty intense background shadow coming out behind this planet, and it actually has multiple background shadows on it. So we're going to add that custom shadow rule here as well. This is going to as well be pretty complex to actually make this look like this glowing planet on the screen, but stick with me and we can create this. So we're going to have a custom shadow rule, and it's going to be first one is going to be -20 pixels, -20 pixels. It's going to be 50 pixels of blur, and we're going to have that be white with 50%. So that's RGB 255, 255, 255, and then 0.5 should make that white with 50% opacity. And that's going to be the first part of our shadow. So let's just see real quickly that that shows on the screen, and you can see that it indeed does. In order to add additional shadows, all we need to do is add a comma between them. So I'm going to have another shadow, and it's going to be -20 pixels, which is going to be -20 pixels to the left direction. It's also going to be -20 pixels towards the top. It's going to be 80 pixels of blur, _80 pixels. And then we have RGB, and it's going to be white with 10% opacity. So 255, 255, 255.1 should give it that 10% opacity that we need. Let's go ahead and give it the next parentheses that we have there. And we did something a little bit wrong here. Let me ensure that we have everything correct. I think we didn't need 2 of those. So let's double check that. Okay, it's glowing a little bit more. So let me go ahead and go back to my shadow. And we have one more shadow that we're going to see behind this planet. So let's go ahead and add another comma and say 0, 0, 50 pixels of blur. And then that is going to be a purple color of RGB 140, 69, 255. And we'll see that that shows up as well. So we have all 3 of those shadows, those drop shadows that are working in tandem. Now, as you can see, I'm using some pretty complex shadows and backgrounds here, and they might look a little bit confusing in the Tailwind CSS custom values, but let me show you exactly how you would normally write one of these if you're writing your CSS. I'm going to just open up a new file, and it's going to say background, or just give it a random class. It doesn't matter what the class is. I just want to kind of demonstrate how this would look. So let me go ahead and write my CSS there. And then I'm going to grab my shadow value that I just created, and we're going to drop this into my CSS. So I'm going to just copy and paste this into foo. I'm going to say box-shadow, and we're going to paste this into here. Now, the only difference that we would have if we were putting this in CSS is instead of our underscores, we would have spaces. So we would have these spaces here. And of course, we could also make this look a little prettier by going ahead and giving a new line in between all of our commas. And we could go ahead and remove, of course, all of our underscores. So let me do that real quick with some IDE trickery, and then we can kind of see what this looks like. So this isn't anything crazy. It basically just says that we have 20 pixels negative to the left direction, negative 20 pixels to the top direction, 50 pixels of blur, and then we have a color. And then the same thing is repeated, negative 20 pixels to the top, negative 20 pixels to the left, 80 pixels of blur, and then a color with a 0.1% opacity. And then the same thing is true for our third shadow. It's just exactly in the center. It has 50 pixels of blur, and then it has our purple color there. So you can see that actually gets demonstrated in what we see on the page, but I just wanted to kind of explain a little bit more what this would actually look like in CSS versus what you're actually seeing in our Tailwind CSS custom box shadow class. Of course, the same thing is true for our backgrounds where we do custom linear gradients, is that we can write this in CSS, but of course it's just a lot faster for us not to have to worry about what is our class name, linking all that up, seeing this versus our HTML. It's very easy for us to do this directly in our JSX, the way that we're doing it here. And then we don't need to worry about all of the things with naming structure and class names and all that. So let me go ahead and close that out. I just wanted to kind of demonstrate that real quick. Now that we've created our planet, let's go ahead and create the rings around our planet. And these are going to be absolutely positioned as well. So let me go ahead and create another div under my planet div. I'm going to say div class name, and this is going to be our first ring. So it's also going to be absolute, but we're going to give a specific height and width to this as well. So it's going to be a custom value of 344 pixels. The width is going to be a custom value as well of 344 pixels. And we're going to give it a border just so that we can see it. And we also know that it's going to be rounded full. So let's go ahead and do rounded full, and let's see what we see right here. This is good, but of course it's not going to be centered. In order to get it centered, we're going to use the same strategy that we used with our planet. So we're going to say top 1/2, we're going to say left 1/2, and then we're going to use the negative translates in order to take away the spacing that we need to get it back to the center. So negative translate x 1/2 and negative translate y, if I could type 1/2, should get it back to the center of our page, which indeed it does. We also know that it's going to have some opacity here. So I'm going to go ahead and give this opacity of 20, and that should give it the opacity that we need. Now, the reason I don't actually give this direct opacity with border white /20, you'll see here in a second, because we actually need everything inside to have the same opacity. So I'll show you how all that works here in 1 second. Okay, so now that we have the ring, there are actually little items on the ring that are going to be floating around our planet. So those are actually going to go inside here so that they can be sized according to this div element. So they can be sized within this 344 pixels. So the first one is going to be an 8x8 little dot around our ring, and that's going to be div class name equals, and we'll just go ahead and give this absolute as well. So absolute, and we'll say that it is going to be h2 width 2. For now, it is going to say top 0 and left 0, just so we can get this to show up. And we also want to give it a background color. So I'm going to say BG white. Now let's see where this shows up. You can see this is showing up right here. We'll need to give this rounded full, and we know that we actually want this to show up on the left center of this ring. So in order to do that, we're going to say top 1/2. That should push it down. The left, of course, is going to be 0. So let me go ahead and come back here and remove this top value there so that we have it right. Top 1/2, the left is already 0, so that can stay the same. And then we want to translate this in the negative direction. So I'm going to say negative translate x 1/2, and that should put it in the center there. And then I'm also going to say negative translate y 1/2, and that should actually just put it exactly in the right spot where we're going to want it. We also need another one of these same dots on the top according to the design. So let me just go ahead and copy and paste this little dot right here. I'm going to ensure that we have it in the right position though. So it's in the same position as our current one. We don't want it to be. So we want the left in this case to actually be 1/2 and the top to be 0. So that should hopefully put it on the top in the center, as we can see right here. And then with our negative translates of x and y, we should have it directly in the center of that ring. Now our third item on the ring is going to be just a little bit trickier because it's going to be the combination of two elements. So let's go ahead and create that third item. I'm going to actually copy and paste one of my other items into a third element. And then I'm going to say that this is going to be a little bit different because we're going to put it all the way over to the right, and we're also going to put it halfway down. So the top in this case is going to be 1/2. The left is going to be actually full, I would say. And then with our negative translates, that should put it in the right spot. But it isn't this size. It's actually going to be a 20 by 20. So we need to change this to H5W5, and that should change that appropriately. And we also don't want the border to be, or the background to be white. We want it to have a border and border white. That should give it the border that we need. And then this is also going to be inline flexed, and that should allow us to put another div inside of it. So I'm going to say div class name, and this is going to be H2 width 2, BG white. Let's see where that shows up at. And then let's see if we can inline flex this one in order to get the other div towards the center. So I'm going to say inline flex items center justify center, and hopefully that will put our div in the center, which it does. And then we could just say rounded full on our second one, and that should make sure that it's exactly where it needs to be. Okay, so as you can see, we have our first ring around our planet looking good, but let's talk for a second about why we didn't choose to do this a little bit differently. So I put my opacity 20 here, but I'm going to take that away, and I'm going to go ahead and save this again. Now it's all white. If I had said border white here /20 to give my 20% opacity on my border, and I also said border there, you would see that we would have the correct border color. But let's do the same thing on each one of these. So this one has a ring, and we have our BG of white. We could say BG white /20, and that creates the right color for that. But as you can see, as we zoom into this view a little bit, let me go ahead and open this up, and we'll zoom in to see what this is actually doing. We're actually getting this overlay where in the middle, we're starting to get this 40 by 40. Let me scale this to 200%. We're actually getting this middle where you can see where it's crossing through. We don't want to be able to see where it's crossing through. We want all of it to be exactly the same color and look like it's all one element. And that's why we don't do the overlapped opacity, is because you can then see through one element to another. Instead, if we make it all white and then the entire element, we go ahead and give it the opacity that we need, that's when we can start to see it the right way. So I'm going to put this back to 100%. I'm going to take this back to just our standard BG white. And then the same thing is true of the border. We're going to say border white. That's going to be true. And then when we set the whole thing to opacity 20, then you can see it knocks everything down at once and makes it show up exactly as we want it to. Now that we've done our first ring, we have the general idea of what we're going to do with each of these rings, which is we're going to make sure that they're set to the right size, and we're going to make sure that they're positioned as they should be. So the next ring is going to be a lot simpler because it's just a dashed line. So I'm going to create another div below my first ring. I'm going to say div class name equals absolute. And we know that we're going to have a specific height and width for this. So this looks like it's going to be our 444 pixels, and width is going to be the same, 444 pixels. We know that it's going to be rounded full. We know it's going to have a border. That border is going to be, in this case, we can, because we're not overlapping elements, we can just say border white /20, and that should give it the right color. Let's just see how it's looking right now. Okay, so we don't have it positioned correctly. In order to position it, we'll just say top 1/2, left 1/2 if we're doing centering, which of course we are, and then we can say negative translate x 1/2 and negative translate y 1/2, and that should put it in the center as we want it to be. And of course we want this to be dashed, so we're going to say border dashed, and that should make it a dashed line. Let me save that and see what that looks like. And it looks like it's positioned correctly. It looks like it's colored correctly. But now we're seeing a little bit of overflow into our header. So in order to fix that, we can just make sure that in this particular section, we don't have any overflow showing by saying overflow hidden, and that should ensure that we don't have that overflow showing on the top. And the reason we're still seeing that overflow is because we haven't set a relative position for our elements yet. That's actually, we need to do that by saying relative here. That should set the relative position for our elements. And now that we have our relative class added into our section and all of our absolute positioned elements are being positioned relative to our section, we can see that our content isn't quite in the right place. And in order to correct that, we're just going to need to go ahead and give it a little bit of margin top to ensure that our content moves down as it should. So I'm going to say MT16 here. That's going to give it that 64 pixels of margin top. That's going to ensure that the content moves back to where it should have been in the first place. Now that all that's taken care of, we have our planet, we have our first ring and our second ring. Now we need to create our third ring around this planet that we can see in the mobile view. This is also going to have, like our first ring, it's going to have a couple of things rotating around it. So we're going to make sure that those are in there as well. So in order to create that, let's go ahead and create one more absolute position element, div class name equals absolute. This is going to have a height, I think they're growing by 100. So I'm going to say height of 544 pixels, a width of 544 pixels. We have a rounded full again, of course we know that. We also know that we're going to have a border on this, and we're going to give it a border white, and we know that we want it to be centered as well. So we're going to say top 1/2, left 1/2, negative translate x 1/2, and negative translate y 1/2 as well. Now it has inside of it a couple of extra items on this particular path. So I'm going to go inside of this one after we have ensured that it's showing up correctly, which of course it is. And we're just going to duplicate the items that we already have created up here. So I'm going to go ahead and duplicate those on our little path here, and we'll ensure that they're showing up on the left and the right by, instead of having it be left 0, top 1/2, this one is correct. So we want it to be 50% from the top and left 0, but the other one we want to be 50% from the top and left full. So let's try that. So we'll say top 1/2 and we'll say left full. That will ensure that they're showing up in the right spot. Now we're not going to see these right now in the mobile view. We may have to go to our tablet view to make sure that these are correct. So we'll do that when we hit our responsive views, and we'll make sure that we get these in the right position. As we did in our first ring, we're going to have to make sure this entire thing is opacity 20 to ensure that we have the right level of opacity to show all of this together in one layer. Now, so far this section is looking really good on the mobile view, but there are a couple things that I'm still seeing that aren't quite right. And one of them is that we're not seeing that purple background for this section that we know should be there. And we could add this to our style tag, but I would like to continue to try and use our TailwindCSS classes. So we're going to add this as an overlay over our stars. So I'm going to create another div at the bottom of our absolute divs that we already have overlaying our section. And I'm going to say class name equals absolute, inset 0 to make it the same size as the section itself. And in this, I'm going to put my radial gradient. So I'm going to say BG, and I'm going to give it a custom value of radial gradient. And inside that radial gradient, we're going to have it be 75% at center, and we're going to start giving it our colors. So the first color it's going to start out with is this RGB, this purple color of 140, 69, 255.5 at 15%. And then it's going to go to RGB 14036.5. And that's going to be at 78%. And when it ends, it's going to go to transparent. Now, as soon as I save that, you can see that we get that nice purple background behind our planet that really gives it that extra level of polish. The other thing that I'm seeing in our design is that it kind of fades out at the top and the bottom. We'd like to have our rings kind of fade out as they get up towards the top and the bottom as well. So I'm going to add a mask over this section that ensures that we don't see anything when it starts and we don't see anything when it ends, but we only see things in the center. And how I'm going to do that is I'm going to come up to my section, I'm going to say mask image, and we're going to give that a linear gradient. And that's just going to go to bottom, and it's going to go from transparent to black at 10% to black at 90%, just to ensure that everything in between there doesn't change, and then it fade to transparent again. That's essentially going to say everything between 10% and 90% of this section is actually going to show, but it's going to fade out at the top and the bottom. So you see that adds that really nice effect. Let me show you that again. I'm just going to cut it and paste it so you can see what it looks like without it. So let me cut that, save it, and you can see that it goes all the way to the top. It kind of has that jarring start and stop there, but as soon as I paste that mask image in, it just gives it that nice fade off the screen, a nice fade off the screen at the bottom as well. So it just gives it that really, really nice, clean look. Now that our mobile view is looking great, we need to go to the tablet and the desktop view as well. So I'm going to go ahead and close out my sidebar to give a little bit more room for my code and open up my tablet view and see if I can stretch this out to be 100% of the size so we can see what it actually looks like. At the tablet view, a lot of our sizes are starting to change. We want our text to be much bigger because we have more space to work with. So I'm going to see what changes there, and it looks like our text size goes a lot higher. So I'm going to say at the medium size, our text is going to be a custom size of 168 pixels. We don't have that within TailwindCSS. We're going to have to set that as a custom value. And we'll say that at our medium size as well, the leading will be none. That just ensures we don't have any line height that's going to change that, but it doesn't look like we had any anyway, so that's fine. We also want to change the size of our paragraph, so let's go ahead and do that as well. So we'll say at the medium size, this becomes text XL, so that should change that to the right size. And we also want to make sure that this is in a container to make sure it doesn't go too far left and right. So we're going to say is max width XL, that should give it that max width of 576 pixels, and then we'll say MX Auto to bring it back to the center by giving it a left and right margin of auto. Now this is only going to happen at the medium size. However, it's not going to matter because this max width is just a max width. So when we go down to our mobile size, let's go back there for 1 second. Let's bring this back down to 100% and scroll this back in. Okay, there it goes down. And you can see that as we pull the mobile view out a little bit by rotating our device, you can see that it's just not going to really matter because our container is constraining the width of that until we get to our tablet size. So let me rotate that back the right way and come to our tablet size, and you can see that this now sits in the spot that we want it to. There are a couple more things that change at the tablet size, and one of those things is going to be the size of our section itself. The planet size, the ring size, pretty much everything gets bigger at this tablet size. So let's see, our section grows to 800 pixels tall instead of our original 492. So we need to add that in as well. So we'll say at the medium size, we have a height of 800 pixels, and that should make that section size grow as long as I use the right syntax. After that, let's go to our planet and make sure that it's the right size as well. So our planet is going to be right here. We can even add a couple of comments to ensure that we know what's what. So I'm going to say right here, I'm going to say start planet, and then we can use a comment below it to say end planet. And that helps us to just understand where that planet is at. We can say the same thing for all these. We can have our rings as well. So we can say, we'll go ahead and give it a little comment and say start ring 1. And we'll copy that down here. And then we say this is the end of ring 1. And then we're going to have a start of ring 2 right here. And we'll also say end ring 2 at the bottom of that. And we have our start of ring 3. So I'm going to copy this again and end of ring 3 right at the bottom of that. So those comments just kind of help us align as to what we're looking at. Now the planet itself we know needs to be a different size. So if I look at the design, it looks like it's actually going to go to a 384 size. So here I'm going to say medium height is going to be 96 to give it that. Oops, that's not a custom value. That's actually Tailwind provided. So medium height is 96. And we also want our medium width to be 96 as well to give it that 384 pixels in size. Our ring sizes are also all going to change. So when we get to the medium size, our ring 1 is going to be 580 pixels and not 344. So we'll say medium and give it a custom value of height 580 pixels. And the same thing is true of our width. So width of 580 pixels, that should give that first ring the right size. Let's continue to size up these other rings as well. So these are going to go up, instead of going up by 100 pixels in height and width, now they're going to go up, I believe, by 200 pixels in height and width. So the next ring is going to be medium height of 780 pixels and medium width of 780 pixels. And that gets even bigger. You can see that pretty well. And then as we go the ring 3, that also has a medium height of 980 and a medium width of custom value of 980 pixels as well. Now this section is looking really spectacular on the tablet. You can see because we absolutely positioned the ring items inside of the rings themselves, those stay in place exactly as we want them to. And then because we have this gradient just kind of smoothly bringing our section on and off the page, that's working really well as well. Now that we have our tablet view taken care of, let's move on to the desktop view and see if there's anything else that we need to take care of in this view as well. So let's go ahead and open this up to where we can get it to 100% of the size so we can really take in what it actually looks like. And it looks like it's working really well. The one thing that I'm noticing is that as we scroll down, because we can in this desktop view, we can scroll down, we should be noticing that this header is sticky. It should be scrolling along with our content. Let's go back into the header file and ensure that we have that working well, and then we'll come back and ensure that it's already looking well as well. So let me go ahead and open up my sidebar for a second. Let's open up my header, and we have a really small view. Let's go ahead and close down that sidebar again and go ahead and make sure that our header has a class name of sticky. Sticky should work. Let's see if it scrolls, and we'll say top 0. That should give it the top value that it needs. Okay, now we're seeing that our header is scrolling. Now it's actually winding up because there are some absolutely positioned elements there. It's actually winding up underneath of our other content. So we need to say, give it a Z index to ensure that it stays on top of the content. I think for now Z10 should ensure that it stays on top of the content as it should. We also want the backdrop to be blurred. We can't see it too well yet, but we can tell that there's no blur going on with our backdrop, and that's going to be whatever the container is that we're actually constraining here. That's going to be the one that we're giving this border white to right here. So let's see if we can say backdrop blur, and that should hopefully give it a little bit of blur as it goes over the other sections. It looks like it does. It's kind of hard to see right now, so we'll continue to massage that as we go to other sections of the page. With that, I think we've wrapped up our hero section. It's looking really great. We haven't added any effects yet. We'll come back and do that after we have everything statically created. But for now, this is looking really, really solid, and this is an eye-catching part of the page for sure. As we come down to the next section of the page, which is the logo ticker, we can see that it's not an overly complex section, but it will be an eye-catching section because we're going to have some text on the left, and then over on the right, we're going to have these logos fading in and fading out as they leave the screen. So this logo ticker is going to go from left to right, and of course we're going to have a couple of fades. You can't see this right now on this desktop view because there's not another logo right here, but that is what is going to happen, as you probably saw in the preview. Coming into the tablet view of this, we're just going to be showing fewer logos. We're going to have the same text over here. It looks like it's going to be about the same size, so we're going to take care of that. And then at the mobile view, we're probably only going to be able to see about one logo at a time in that logo ticker. So we'll ensure that we do all that when we code this section. As we come into our code, we'll know that we need to open up our logo ticker.tsx. Right now, this is just returning a simple div. So let's put this into our page. Let's go over to source/app/page, import our logo ticker from @/sections/logo ticker, and then drop this as the next section in our page by dropping that logo ticker component on there. If we save that and we scroll down, we should see logo ticker section showing up as text, and indeed we do, which means that it's all hooked up with our page. So let's go ahead and close out our page.tsx and concentrate on our logo ticker code. In order to start creating this section, we're going to create a semantic section tag. Inside that section, we're going to have a div with a class name of container to constrain our content inside that container so it's not touching the left and the right sides of the screen. And then inside that container, we know that we're going to have a div that's going to be flexing two different divs. One of them is going to have a div that says trusted by top innovative teams, and the other one is going to be a div with all of our logos in it. So that's going to be this div, and we can of course bring in all of our logos. One thing I'll change here, I actually don't want this to be a div. I'll actually make this an H2 because it's much more semantic to actually what's going on. That's actually a title for that section. So that'll be more appropriate there. In order to get our logos in here, well, let's go ahead and import all of those. So we're going to import our Acme logo from @/assets/acme logo acme.png. And we're going to do the same thing for our Apex logo. So import Apex logo from @/assets/Apex or logo Apex, kind of import. And they should all follow the same syntax. So let's see if we can make this a little faster just by using some IDE magic. So I'm going to actually give this the celestial, the quantum, the things that change. Pulse should be there. echo, and let's see if we can just select all of these by selecting the line break itself. We're going to say import. We're going to go to say logo. Let me make sure before I do that I copy this because we're going to need that for here in a second. From @/assets/logo dash, and then paste that .png, and hopefully that's all of our logos that we need. That's a little bit of fun little IDE magic for you there. Just doing some simple selection keyboard shortcuts to make that all happen. Now, in order to show our logos, we'll go ahead and loop through those here. So we're going to have our logos, so we can create an array of those by going ahead and inserting this JSX brackets. We're going to have our Acme logo, our Pulse logo, our Echo logo, our Celestial, Apex, and Quantum is going to be the last logo that we have. Let me double check this Echo one to make sure that we're actually pulling in the right one. So let's see, logo, Echo. Okay, great. We are pulling in the right asset there. So that should be good. And then we just need to map over those. So I'll say .map. And for each of those logos, we're going to return some JSX, and that's just going to be an image tag. So I'm going to say img, and then source equals our logo. Now we need to give that a logo value so that we can use that. So I'm going to say logo.src. That should enable us to use that source there. Our key is going to be logo.src. That's the best way to identify those. And then we're also going to have a class name for each of those as well. Let's see if that shows up on the page. And it looks like we couldn't find our Quantum logo. So let me double check and make sure that that is named the way that it should. Oh, it's actually misnamed here. So I'm going to rename that as logo Quantum and ensure that that shows up as it should. Now our logos are showing up, but of course they're not the right height and width. They're not constrained as they should be. So let's say height is going to be a 6 for 24 pixels. The width is going to be auto. So I'm going to say width auto, and let's see if that shows them as the right size, and it does, which is great. And then we're also going to say that we have a flexed container around those, so div class name equals flex, and flex none should ensure that the logos can take up as much space as they need to. We're going to give those a gap of 14 or 56 pixels, and we're going to make sure at the mobile size that both our H2 and our logos themselves are taking up the same amount of space. In order to do that, what we'll need to do is make sure that this is flex, so class name equals flex, and then we'll say that each of these two divs here, so I'm going to wrap a div around my H2, and I'm going to say class name equals flex1, that'll take up 1 unit of space, and the same thing is going to have to be true of this one. So let me see if I can say flex1 here, and no, that doesn't allow me to do that because I have my flex none rule there, so I'm going to have to wrap it in another div just so I can have a container to be able to say class name equals flex1 to make it take up as much space as my text does. Now the reason this isn't working quite yet is because we still have a very large div over here. So I need to tell this wrapping container that I'm going to be hiding the overflow. So I'm going to say overflow hidden, and that should ensure that the div is able to be the right size. So it's just going to kind of wrap that and ensure that those logos can continue to go off the screen, but we're going to hide any overflow on this div. The other thing we're going to want to do on this div is ensure that we have our mask set up so that we can see our logos going on and off the screen like we should be. And so I'm going to say mask image, and that's going to be a linear gradient, and it's going to go from right to left, so to right, or sorry, from left to right, so to right, from transparent. It's going to go to black at 20%. And then we're going to say black again at 80%, and then it's going to go to transparent again. So that should mask that the right way. And then we also want to ensure that our flex containers are both set to center on the y-axis. So I'm going to say items center or line item center. That should take care of that. And we know that this section needs a little bit more space as well. So we'll come up here to the section and say class name equals PY20. That should give it the 80 pixels of space on the top and bottom that we need for this particular section. Now that we have that working, let's see what it looks like on our tablet view. So let me go ahead and switch over to my tablet view on my Polypane browser, and let me open this up and to get it to 100%. Now that it's at 100%, we can see that we do see our logo fading on the page and off the page. But at this view, we want our logos showing up right next to our text. So at this view, we don't want these to be flex one, and taking up the same amount of space. We actually want our text being just the size of the text, and then we want our other item to be as big as it can be. So in order to do that, we'll just say at medium, we'll say flex none. Let me see if that works. And indeed it does. That makes our logos take up more space, which is what we wanted. And we also want to make sure that there's a little bit of space in between our title for our section and our logos themselves. So we'll say gap 5, and that should ensure that we did that as we wanted to. At this size, there's also a little bit of a padding change on the top and bottom. So it looks like we go up to, instead of 80, we go up to a 96 pixel padding. So I'm going to say on the medium size, we'll say PY24 to give it that 96 pixels of padding, and that should ensure that we have the right padding on the top and bottom. After that, let's look at what it looks like on the desktop size to ensure that everything looks good there as well. So I'm going to come over to my desktop size, pull my code window out or my browser window out to see it at hopefully near 100%. I'm going to put my list of files in just so we can give a little bit more room for our code and ensure that this looks good at this size as well. And it appears that everything is looking good at this size as well. Let me go back one more time and go to my horizontal mode. That'll ensure that we can go through each of our sizes and ensure that we don't see anything broken in our logo ticker. And it doesn't look like anything is. It looks like we have our appropriate responsive styles set up. We can see things changing on each view, and this is looking really good. One of the things that I'm noticing now that we've been able to scroll the page a little bit because we have a couple of sections is that our header is now looking like in the mobile view, it's not showing the blur as we would want it to in that mobile view. So let's see if we can actually fix that. I'm going to bring my browser window back in, go ahead and switch over to my focus mode again by just hitting F on Mac, go over to my mobile view, bring that browser window in, and let's ensure that we have our header set up correctly. So I'm going to go back to my header, and let's see, we have our backdrop blur, but we only really want this to take effect in this spot on the medium screen size. So I'm going to say medium backdrop blur, and that should take that backdrop blur away. And we really want that backdrop blur to show up over the entire section at our small size. So let's see what happens when we say backdrop blur here and hit save. It looks like that is showing up the way that we want it to. I'm seeing the blur. It's a great effect. And as we go to the medium size, we should see that the backdrop blur then moves to here. Now, in order for that to happen, we want to say backdrop blur none here or something to that effect to ensure that it's not showing up as soon as we get to the medium size. So let's say medium backdrop blur none. And that should ensure that at the medium size, it switches from this div, the wrapping header div, into the div that it contains our elements. So let's double check that. Let's go to each of our breakpoints by opening our screen again all the way. Let's go to our horizontal view and let's double check that as we scroll down that we see things working the way that they should. And for some reason, I'm not seeing my backdrop show up correctly in the medium size or really in the large size anymore. So let me come back into my code. Let me specifically focus on the tablet view. I'm going to hit F again to go to focus, go over to tablet. Let's show this at 100%, the smallest screen size it'll allow us to show it 100%, so about right there. And let's go over to our tablet view and see where we could be missing it. So it would appear what's actually going on here is that the TailwindCSS for some reason does not like the responsive changing of a backdrop blur value. So what I think we're going to have to do is we're going to have to create some either absolutely positioned elements that can sit behind our elements to go ahead and blur the backdrop, or we're going to have to use after elements on our elements themselves as our absolutely positioned elements to help us style this backdrop as we need to. I think what's going to be the least confusing is going to be just going ahead and using some absolutely positioned elements as extra elements themselves. So I'm going to bring in an extra div here. I'm going to say class name equals absolute, and it's going to be inset 0 to make sure that it covers the entire header itself. And then we're going to go ahead and give it a backdrop blur. Now, when we do that, you can see that it does indeed blur the backdrop, and we'll go ahead and give it a negative Z index as well to see if that pulls it down to the bottom. And indeed it does. It's already a sticky element, and that will give us the mobile version of the blur that we need. Let me go over to the mobile view and just double check that this is indeed working the way that we want it to. And as I scroll up and down, I can see that the backdrop is being blurred the way that I want, and it's staying underneath of our header section content. So that's working how we want. When we get up to the tablet view, we're not going to want this one to show anymore. So let me go ahead and hide that. So I'm going to say hidden. So instead of backdrop blur none, we're then just going to hide the element itself. So let me go ahead and do that. And as we can see, when we get up to the tablet view, that's going to be hidden. Of course, we want to say medium hidden to ensure that it only hides in the medium size, but that it shows on the mobile size. As we get into the tablet view, we want that element to be constrained to this div instead. So inside of this div, I'm going to add a div class name equals absolute inset 0 again, and I'm going to give this a backdrop blur, and let's see how that shows up. And once again, it's over the entire thing. Let's go ahead and wrap this or constrain this to this div by saying relative here. And it's still over our content, which means we need to pull it back down by saying -z10 as well. And then we see it underneath of our content. So once again, as we scroll up and down the page, we should see that backdrop blur taking effect, but only taking effect inside of the area that we want it to take effect in. And we want this to be hidden until we get to the medium size. So in this case, instead of medium hidden, we're going to say hidden, and then we're going to say medium, and then we can just display it as block. And as we save that, we should see that taking effect the way that we want to. So let's go back to our view. Let's double check on this, at least with the content that we have so far. So I'm going to go back to my horizontal view. I'm going to open this up as much as I can, scroll over all the way to the left, and we see that at the mobile view, we see the backdrop showing in the right area, and then at the tablet size view, we see the backdrop showing in the right area there as well. And then moving over to desktop, we see that that's showing up as it should be. So all that's looking great. Now that we can see what that blur actually looks like with a little bit of content on the page, that enabled us to fix that particular section. Now that we have all that wrapped up, let's go ahead and move on to the next section. Moving past the logo ticker, we're going to get into the product showcase part of this landing page. Now, this is one of the more impressive parts of the page just because of the way we're going to be adding some different animations and some different effects into it. But for now, all we need to do is go ahead and build this particular section. So what I'm seeing is a title, I'm seeing a description, and I'm seeing some things that look like tabs. We can, go ahead and flex these beside each other, and then a product image. So there's nothing entirely hard about the first part of this build. It's going to be animation that where we're really going to step up our game and create some interesting approaches. Moving into the tablet version of this section, we can see that we needed to stack our tabs on top of each other because we just didn't have enough space to show them side by side. So those will be stacked, but our product image will still look pretty much the same. And then into the mobile view, we'll see the same thing is true. We're going to stack our tabs. We're going to show our product image. Our product image is going to be fairly small at this point, but it's just the best we can do with the space that we have available. With all that, let's go ahead and dive into the code and start building this section of the page. Now that we looked at the design for our features section, let's go into sections/features.tsx. As you can see, this section is a little bit different than our other ones because we already have some tab data that we're going to be bringing into this section just to make it a little bit easier as we're coding this out. Now at the bottom, we do still have our exported features section with just a div that says features section. So let's go into our page and hook this section up. Inside of app/page.tsx, we're going to import our features from @section/features, and then we're going to go ahead and drop this into the bottom of our page as the next section on our page. As long as we've done this correctly and we've saved it, we should see the features section show up at the bottom of our page, which means everything is hooked up and ready to go. So we're going to go back to our features and we're going to start coding this section out. Now, the first thing we're going to do is create a semantic section tag, and inside of that, we're going to put a container with a class name of container, and then we'll start creating our JSX for the feature section content. So the first thing is going to be the title. That's going to be a semantic h2 tag, and that is going to say elevate your SEO efforts. And then we also have a description below it that we're going to put in a paragraph tag. I'm just going to copy and paste this from the design, but this says from small startups to large enterprises, our AI-driven tool has revolutionized the way businesses approach SEO. So after we have those two and save it, we should see those come onto the screen, and then we can move on to our tabs. Now our tabs are going to be a little bit different because we already have some data available to us. So what we're going to be able to do is take that tabs data, and we're going to be able to map over it. And for each one of those tabs, we're going to be able to grab the tab data and then show some JSX for it. Now, the first thing we want to do anytime we're mapping over some data inside of React is we want to create a key that lets React know which piece of data this is so it can keep that straight. So we're going to say key equals, and then we just need a unique piece of data to drop in here. It looks like the title is a pretty good one for this. So I'm just going to say tab.title as my key, and that's going to get us started there. Now, for each tab, we have an icon, we have a title, we have an is new piece of data, which is basically going to allow us to show or hide that tag that says whether it's new. And then we also have some things that are just going to help us once we start to animate this particular section. But one thing I'll point out is that we're doing the icons here a little bit differently. You can see that instead of bringing them in from our assets folder like we've traditionally done, we're actually going into the public folder, and we're using the public folder to serve us these .lottie files. You may or may not heard of .lottie before, so let me talk about what this is and what advantage it gives us over the SVGs that we primarily traditionally have used for icons. What I'm going to do is I'm going to come into my Polypane browser. I'm going to open up the bottom tab in the Browse tab, and I'm going to just talk about what is a Lottie file and why we're using it in this particular case. So if we need an animated SVG, which is exactly what we're going to be doing here, then we need a way to be able to animate a vector file. And a Lottie file is a great way to do that. It's actually a platform, but from this platform you can export free .lottie files, which is an open source format that we can use. So we can see here it's a JSON-based animation file format that allows us to ship animations on any platform as easily as shipping static assets. Traditionally, there are a couple of ways we can do animations. You can see we could use a PNG sequence, we could use a GIF, or we could use a Lottie file. And this is primarily showing the size difference in these different ways that we could do that, as well as for things like a GIF or a PNG, those are raster files, are traditionally a lot larger than our smaller SVGs, and in this case .lottie files. And the other advantage really is about the vectorized or rasterized format, because that means we can scale them up or down as we wish, and they're going to keep that crystal clarity. They're going to keep that resolution as we scale them up and down. So it makes it really nice, especially for things like icons that we always want to be crystal clear, no matter what the resolution of the user's browser is. So we see small file size is an advantage. They're scalable. They're multi-platform, so we can drop these not only in the web, we can drop them on native apps, things like that. And then we have the option for interactivity. And this is actually one of the reasons that we've chosen a .lottie file here is because we're going to tell the animation when to take place based on the user's interaction with our page. So we can do that with a Lottie animation, which means it's a really good fit for this particular case. And then we also have a lot of large businesses that use Lottie files on a regular basis. This is a really mature technology. It's not cutting or bleeding edge. It really has been around for a long time. It has great library support. So this is definitely something that makes a lot of sense in our particular case. So all that being said, I just wanted to give you that little primer on Lottie files so that you understand why we're bringing these in differently. And then as we go into the animation, you're going to see how all this works. So in order to bring in our icon for each one of these, I'm going to have a way to show these, because these aren't standard SVGs that we can just bring in as code. This is actually a source, almost like an image source. So I'm going to be able to bring in a Lottie player or a .lottie player in order to show these. So I'm going to import my .lottie player from @.lottie/React player. And then for each one of these, I'm going to go ahead and drop in my .lottie player component, and I'm going to say source equals tab.icon there. And let's see what happens when we just do that without any other props. So I'm going to save that. I'm going to see if I can scroll down, And we do get a server error, and that's because Next.js, this is a client component at this point because it's using this client-side animation. So I need to come in here up to the top and just say use client, the use client directive, and that should allow it to compile correctly. So that is true. So right now, these are way too big. We know we need to cut these down to size, and they are going to be 20 by 20. So I'm going to just say class name equals h5 width 5, and that should cut it down to our 20 by 20. And as you can see, that is the case. In order to see our animations for our .lottie files though, we need to tell it to autoplay. So I'm going to say autoplay as a prop, and then I'm going to save that, and that should, the next time our page refreshes, allow us to see our .lottie animations happen. So I'm going to refresh that, and yes, each of our animations actually does happen. I'm going to actually increase the size of these a little bit just so we can see these a little better. So for now, I'm just going to say 20 by 20, and that's going to increase the size of those. I'm going to refresh this one more time, and you can see that each of those has an individual animation that we can play. We could also loop this. We're not going to do this right now, as in we're not going to, our page is not going to use a looped animation, but for now I'm just going to show you that this capability is there. So if you wanted these animations to loop again and again, that capability is there with a .lottie player, as well as a lot more capability that we're going to dig into as we get more into these animations. So I'm going to remove this loop for now. I'm going to set the class name back to what they're going to be, which is h5 width 5 to make them 20 by 20. And then we're going to leave the autoplay on for now, just to ensure that if someone refreshes the page and they come to that section, they're going to see a little hint that there's some animation going on there. So that'll be one of the things that we have in our tab. The other thing we have in our tab is our title. So I'm going to go ahead and create a div for that title and just say tab.title and end that. And then we also have our isNew tag, which I'm just going to say tab.isNew. If it's true, then we're going to say and we're going to spit out some more JSX for that. And that's going to be div, and we're going to say new, and we're going to end that with a div. So we don't need to have any dynamic text from the tab itself. The last thing we need to put in this section as far as the content goes is the image itself. So let me come down below our tabs and we'll go ahead and put in our product image. For now, we're going to use the next/image tag, but I think we're going to change that because of some different things that we want to do with being able to resize this and kind of move this around and treat this as a background. So for now, I'm going to bring in my image component from next/image. I'm just going to hit enter there and say source equals, and we're going to bring in our product image at the top of the page. So I'm going to import product image from @/asset/product image.png, and then we're going to come down here and say product image is going to be our source. We're going to have to give it an alt tag of product image, and that's for screen readers. And then that's going to allow our product image to show up. Now it's not very large, and that's fine because it's the mobile view. It's kind of the best we can do with what we have, what we're working with here. But this section is still going to be impressive on mobile because of the other styles that we're going to add. Now that we have all of our content on our mobile design for this section, let's go ahead and start to style this up, starting with this section wrapper itself. So in this case, we know that there's going to be some padding here. So I'm going to say class name equals, that's going to be py20 for 80 pixels of padding on the top and the bottom in the mobile view. And as we move down here, we also know that our title is going to have some styles applied to it. So that's going to be text 5XL. And we're also going to make sure that it is font medium. That's the font weight medium. We're going to make sure it's centered with text center. And then we're going to pull in the letters a little bit closer with tracking tighter. That's going to give it a -5% letter spacing, and it's really going to make that match the design a lot more closely. In our description, we're going to have a different text color, and that's going to be text white, but at 70% opacity. So text white 70 will give it that 70% opacity that we need. That's going to be text large at the mobile size. We're going to pull in the letter spacing on this a little bit as well with tracking tight for a -2.5% letter spacing. It's also going to be centered, so text center is also going to be true here. And then we're going to move it away from our title a little bit with MT5, and that should push that down just a little bit, give it a little bit of that margin top that we need. Now for our tabs themselves, we also need a wrapper for these so that we can make sure that we have margin between the tabs and the description as well. So I'm going to say div right here, class name equals, and that's going to be MT10, if I'm not mistaken, to give it 40 pixels of margin on the top side of our tabs. Each of our tabs is also going to have a border. So I'm going to say class name equals border white /15. That'll give it 15% opacity on that border. They're going to be flexed so that the icons and the titles for those particular tags are next to each other. They are going to have a little bit of padding. So it's going to be P2.5 for our 10 pixels of padding on all sides. We're going to give them some border radius with rounded XL. And that's going to give them, I believe, 12 pixels of border radius. And we're going to ensure that the icon and the title and the tag are split with a gap at this level. So we're going to say gap 2.5. That's going to give 10 pixels of space in between all of those items. For our icon, we're going to need to wrap this in a div because we want to put a border around it, and we want to individually style the icon itself as well as the wrapping div. So we're going to say class name equals, and we're going to say H12 width 12 to give that our 48 pixels of height and width. We want to give it a border as well. So border white /15 should do that. And then we want to give it border radius with rounded large to give it the 8 pixels of radius that it needs. And to center our icons in there, we're going to make this inline flexed with inline flex items, center, justify, center, and that should push our icons to the center of this inline flexed item that we have here. Now that we've done that and our icons are a little bit bigger than our title, we're seeing that those aren't center aligned either. So we're going to come back to our wrapper and say that this also needs to say items center, and that should on the y-axis go ahead and center our title with our icon. For the title itself, it doesn't need too many changes. It just needs a font medium to make the font weight just a little bit bolder. And then the tab itself needs to go ahead and have a couple of modifications as well. So we're going to say class name equals, and it's going to be text extra small to give it that 12 pixels of font size. We want it to be rounded full to make sure that it's rounded in a pill-like fashion. We're going to say PX2 for 8 pixels of padding on the left and right, PY 0.5 for 2 pixels of padding on the top and bottom. We're going to say BG, and we're going to give it a custom value of 8C44FF, and that's going to give it that purple background color, but the text is going to be black, so text black. And then we want to say font semi-bold, and that's going to give it that boldness that it needs to show up well as well. Coming back to our tabs wrapper, we know that we need to split each of these tabs and give them a little bit of space in between. So what we're going to do is we're going to flex this in the column direction. So we're going to say flex call. And then once we do that, we can say gap 3, and that should allow the 12 pixels of gap between each of these tabs. Coming down below that, we need to go ahead and take care of our image. So our image is going to have a border around it with some padding and then another border. So there's actually 2 borders around this image. So we need a wrapping div that's going to give it that first border, and then we're going to put a border around the image itself. We're also going to change the aspect ratio of the image. You'll see how to do that here in 1 second. So I'm going to say class name equals, and let's focus on the border at first. So I'm going to say border white /20 in this case. And then we want some padding around that. So I'm going to say P2.5 to fill in that padding. We want it to be rounded XL to give it that 12 pixels of border radius that we need. And then we're going to split the image from the tabs themselves by saying MT3 to give it 12 pixels of top margin. For the image, we don't want the full image to actually display, because as we can see, this is a very tall image, but we actually want the aspect ratio to be more like a video. We want a 16:9 aspect ratio. And then when we click on the tabs, we're actually going to change the focus of the image by using some of our background size and background position attributes. So what we're going to do is, instead of this being an image tag right here, we're actually going to make it a background image. And how we're going to do that is we're going to say div class name equals, and we're going to leave that blank for now, but we're going to add a custom style, and we're going to say background image, and then we're going to use a JavaScript string template to say URL, and then we're going to fill in the product image dot source. So we're essentially saying the background image for this is going to be equal to this URL of product image source, and then we're going to just go ahead and comment out that image that we already have just to make sure that this takes effect. Now, since we don't have a height and width set on this interior div yet, you're going to see that nothing is showing up here right now, and that's fine. We just need to say aspect video, and that's going to give it an aspect ratio of 16:9 and make it still the full width of the interior of this parent div. So that does the trick there. However, the image itself is actually very large, so we also need to say BG cover, and that should allow the actual image to show up at the top of that div. We're also going to give this one a border, so it's going to be border white 20, and that's going to give that the border white with a 20% opacity. We want it to say rounded large to give it a little bit of border radius, and that's going to be about it for that div. So we can go ahead and remove this image down here and look at our section to make sure we haven't missed anything so far in the mobile view. And it's looking really good right now. Really happy with how it's turning out. Let's move on to the other views to see our responsive styles and see what we need to change. Let's go over to our tablet view. I'm going to pull this over just a little bit so that we can get a full size view of this tablet view. So as soon as it hits 100%, I think I'm good. I'm also going to close down for now my sidebar so we can give the code a little bit more room to breathe. And then we're going to take a look at this section and see what else we need to change. Starting from the top again, if we start from our section tag, we can see that there's a little bit more spacing around this section. So I'm going to say at the medium size, we're going to use PY24, and that's just going to add a little bit more space around this section. As we come into the interior of the section, we know that our title is going to increase in size as well. So I'm going to say at the medium size, we're going to use text 6XL, and that's going to increase that size. And our description is also going to increase. So we're going to say medium text XL. That's going to increase that font size. And it's also wider than it should be. We want that to be constrained so that it's more accurate to our design. So we're going to say max width 2XL. That's going to set the max width to 672 pixels. But of course, as soon as we save that, that's actually going to scoot the text to the left because we haven't told it MX auto yet. That's going to give margin left and margin right auto and center our paragraph on the page. As we scroll down and look at the rest of our tablet view, obviously our product image looks a lot better at this size because we can actually see what's going on, and our tabs are still going to be stacked because we don't yet have enough screen real estate in order to make those tabs work yet side by side. So we're going to leave that as is for now. As we go into the desktop size, let's scoot our view over just a little bit more and look at what we have. I'm not going to scoot this over all the way because I need to give my code a little bit of chance to be able to see it for y'all, but let's go ahead and see what needs to change at this size. So the title is still good, the text is still the right size, but now what really changes is our tabs can now be aligned side by side. So before we were doing flex call, now at this size, at the large size, we need to say flex row, and that should put them side by side. And then for each tab, we want them to be the same size. So right now they're being dynamically sized based on the size of their content. So what we're going to say is at the large size, we're going to say flex 1, and that should allow them to take up the same amount of space for every single tab that we have here. I'm not seeing anything else that needs to be done, so let's go ahead and take a look at our horizontal view. I'm going to pull my browser all the way out so that we can take a good look at this section from all different angles, make sure we have all of our responsive views tightened up, and I'm just going to make sure that we also didn't break anything as we were building our responsive view. So everything looks good on the mobile view. It's looking great on the tablet view as well. And as we scoot over to the desktop view, this really is the best view of this section because you really get that product image front and center. So really liking how that section is turning out so far. We're going to do a lot in this section with animations when we get there, but of course we're not there quite yet. We got to build out the rest of the page first, and then we'll come back to our animations. So for now, I'm liking where this section's at. Let's go back and check out the next section in our design. Back in our design, as we're moving down from the features section to the testimonials section, you can see that we're going to have some testimonials that are going to fade on and off the screen and probably scroll left to right or right to left. And for this, there's not too much of a departure from what we've done so far. We're going to have a section with, of course, some padding. We're going to have a title, description, and then we're going to get into each of those testimonials. We're going to make sure that they're flexed side by side so that they scroll off the screen over here somewhere, and then they're going to go ahead and give us that infinite scroll effect. As we move into the tablet view, you can see that the size of these testimonials increases a little bit, as well as the size of our title and description. So we'll make sure to make that change. And on the desktop view, it really is just the best way to view this page. You're getting a lot of great, smooth, polished effects at the desktop size. It really just makes this page pop at the desktop size because you just have plenty of room for these different sections to breathe. So this doesn't change too much from the tablet view. I think everything is pretty much the same size, but we'll make sure and double check that as we go. But without further ado, let's go ahead and dive into our code. Moving back into our code, let's go into source/sections/testimonials. And you can see we do have all of the testimonials in an array as well, which is of course going to help us as we're coding this up. We have all of our avatar images already being brought in, and then we have our testimonials component exporting a div with a testimonials section text. So let's go ahead and hook this up to our page by going into app/page, and then we're going to import our testimonials from @/section/testimonials and drop this in as the next section of our page. As long as we're all hooked up, we should see the testimonial section text at the bottom, which we do. We can close down our page and dive into our testimonials section. First thing we want to do is get the content on the page so that we can style it. So let's go ahead and return a semantic section tag. Inside that, we'll have a class name of container, which of course we always do at this point. And then inside there, we want to have our title. That's going to be an H2, and it's going to say beyond expectations. And our paragraph under that is going to be the description. From the design, it looks like that says our revolutionary AI SEO tools have transformed our client strategy. So I'm going to copy and paste that from the design and make sure that that is in there. And then below that is where we're going to put our testimonials. So we're going to have each of our testimonials. We're going to map over those. So say testimonials.map. And then for each of those testimonials, we're just going to say testimonial. And then we're going to export some JSX for each of those. We're going to have a div for each of those, and that div is going to have a key so that React knows which testimonial we're referring to. Now, the best key, I think, in this case might just be our testimonial name. That's an easy, short, and it's going to be distinct per testimonial, so that makes it a good key. So let me go ahead and say testimonial.name, and that should be a good key for that. Inside of that, we're going to have a div that's going to be the text of this testimonial. So let's say testimonial.text. That's going to be there. And then we're also going to have an avatar. So we're going to say, we can use next/image for now, although we may change that in the future. We'll see. So source is going to be testimonial.avatar_image. The alt tag is probably going to be the name of the person. So I'm going to say testimonial.name, and we can even use a template literal here to say that we could use a string and say avatar for, and then go ahead and say testimonial.name in there. And that will allow it to be a dynamic alt tag added there. The other two things that we're going to need is the name and the description. So I'm going to say div, and we don't need a class name yet. We're just going to say testimonial.name. And then the other thing is going to be the title of the person. So testimonial.title is going to go ahead and allow us to see that title on the screen. So if that worked out correctly, what we should see are all of our testimonials with an image, a name, a title for those, and of course our text up here with what each of these people has said in their testimonial. Now that we have everything on the screen as far as our content goes, let's go ahead and start adding classes to style this up. Starting with the section, we're going to go ahead and add some padding around that. That's going to be a class name of py20, and that's going to give us our 80 pixels of padding on the top and bottom that we need. Our title is going to be very similar to the last title that we have. So we're going to say class name equals text 5XL. to create that title. We're going to say that it is centered, so text center. We're going to make the letter spacing a little tighter by saying tracking tighter to pull in that letter spacing. And we also want font medium to go ahead and just make that title a little bolder. For our description, we want to come down and give it a class name as well. And that's going to be text white 70 to lighten that up a bit. It's also going to have a text size of large or 18 pixels. It is going to be in the center as well, so text center should take care of that. And we want it to be pushed down from the title with MT5. That should take care of that. We're going to tighten up this text just a little bit with tracking tight, and that's going to put the negative 2.5% letter spacing that we need to match our design. For the testimonials themselves, this is where things get a little bit trickier as far as our styling goes. So the first thing we want to do is go ahead and give the testimonials themselves a class name so that we can style the div around each of these testimonials. Each of these divs are going to have a border, so border white /15, and of course we need to add the border class as well to make that show up. We also want to have some padding here, so that's going to be P6 to add the 24 pixels of padding that exists on mobile. We want them to have some border radius as well, and that's going to come from our rounded XL class, which should give it the 12 pixels of border radius that we need. And then we also need to make sure that it has the right background gradient. So this is going to be a custom gradient. So we're going to say BG, and then we're going to give it a custom gradient of linear gradient. And that's going to be to bottom left. And it's going to go from RGB 140.69.255.3. And it's going to go to black. So after we do that, we should be able to see a custom gradient on each of those. And indeed we do. After that, let's go ahead and modify our testimonial text style. So let's go ahead and add a class name here, and that's just going to be text large. And we're also going to make sure that the tracking is tight to give it that negative letter spacing that just pulls the letters in together a little bit. We also down here for our image name and title are going to have to add a div wrapper around these because we want these to be flexed a little bit differently. So let me go ahead and add a div wrapper around all three of those items, and we're going to say class name equals flex, and that should put them beside each other. Now we know that we only want to flex the image beside both our testimonial and our title, so we're going to add a div wrapper around those as well, and that should make sure that those get held top to bottom instead of side to side. We know that we're going to put these in the center or align them to the center. So I'm going to say items center, and that should take care of that. We also want a gap between them, so gap 3 should give them the 12 pixels of gap that we need, and then MT5 should give it 20 pixels of spacing between the image, the title, and the name, and our text of the person that said the quote. Now right now, of course, our image is a little large, so we need to scale that down to size, and it looks like we're going to have an 11 by 11 image or a 44 by 44 pixels. So let's go ahead and say a class name here, and we'll say H11 with 11, and that should scale that down to the size that we need. We want to say rounded large to be able to add some border radius to that as well. And then we'll need a way to shift the color of these images in order to make them have that kind of purple color that we see in the design. So the first thing we're going to do is actually going to make the images grayscale by saying grayscale, and that's going to give it a filter that's going to actually just filter it to a grayscale image. And then from there, we can go ahead and add an overlay. And then from there, we should be able to add an overlay to that image and then mix it with soft light blending in order to create the purple look that we see. So in order to add an overlay, we're actually going to need to wrap a div around the image itself, and that div we're going to use to add, that overlay to our image. So as soon as that refreshes, hopefully that'll refresh properly. Let's scroll down back to our testimonials and let's see what we have here. So the first thing we want to do here is say class name, and we're say relative in order to add an absolute overlay. We're also going to add in an after element, and the after element is basically going to take care of adding the overlay that we need. So we're going to say after content, and we're going to give it some content so that shows up on the screen. We're also going to say that it's going to be absolute position, so absolute. It's going to be inset 0 to make it the size of the image, and in order to see if it's showing up, we're going to say after BG and give it a custom background of RGB 140 69 255, and that should give it the custom background that we need. Now you can see that that's covering the image right now, which is kind of what we wanted, but of course we want the image to be able to show through as well. So that's going to come in with the blending. So we're going to say after mix blend soft light, and this is going to give it a mix blend mode of soft light. And as soon as we save that, that should allow the image to show through. The only other thing that I'm seeing that's not in our image right now, but is on the design, is a border around each of our images. So let's see if we can add this border here. So I'm going to say border white /30 and see if that adds the appropriate amount of border to the image. And it looks like what's actually going on is our border should be overlaying both our image and our overlay itself. So we need to move this border into a before element in order to show it over top of our image and our purple overlay. So I'm going to actually move this into here. I'm going to say before content and then nothing and then an empty string so that you can see the before element on the page. We're going to say before is also absolute. Before element is also going to be inset 0, and then the before element is going to have our border. So before border and before border white /30. And that should allow the border to show up. Now it does show up on the screen right now, but we need to add some z-index in order to bring it on top of everything else. So I'm going to say before z10 to get that up top, and then we need to give it the rounded border radius to make sure that it's showing up the way that we want it to. So I'm going to say rounded large before rounded large, and that should allow it to show up on top of the image. So that is looking really good right now. We have this border that's just highlighting the outside of this image, but all of our images are now showing up with this purple overlay, even though they started with color. This is a really cool technique for us to be able to use, and that's basically just being able to use some of the filtering that modern browsers allow us to do with images and colors. Moving on to our name and title for each person, let's go ahead and add a class name here and make sure that we have our div flexed with flex call. And let's see, that didn't change it at all. So I'm actually not concerned with that being there. Our name, I don't think changes either. I think it's really only our title that we're going to make a little bit smaller and a little bit lighter. So I'm going to say class name here, say text white 50, and then text small should make the text smaller and lighter, and that should make our testimonials show up the way that we want them to. Now, in order for our testimonials to show up beside each other instead of top to bottom, we're going to need to do a little bit more work to get this to work the way that we want. The first thing we're going to do is go ahead and say that the max width for these is going to be 320. So I'm going to say max width extra small, and that'll give it that 320 pixels of max width. Now, in order to get our testimonials to show up left to right instead of top to bottom, we need to wrap them in a div that's going to control that spacing. So we'll go ahead and come up above our testimonials and we'll say create a new div tag, and then we'll put our ending div tag below our testimonials. And from there, we can go ahead and say class name equals flex gap 5, and that should have them show up side by side. Now, of course, we don't want this container to control the height of these items. So on each of our testimonials, we need to add a class of flex none. That's going to ensure that Flexbox is not what's controlling their size, but that they're controlling their own destiny as far as that's concerned. Then, in order to get everything to work correctly, we need to come up above this div and wrap it in another div that's just going to make sure that we have our overflow hidden set, because right now what you can see in the Polypane browser, it gives you this little almost like cheat code that says for this section we're seeing horizontal overflow that's being detected. We know that's going to be the case because we're lining our testimonials side to side so that we can scroll through them. So we need to say for this one, we're going to say class name equals overflow hidden, and that's going to ensure that we don't have that side-to-side problem that we were seeing before. Now this will still say that until we do a full refresh because it doesn't know that that's gone away. But now that we did a full refresh, we can't scroll side to side, and now it's showing 1 because our next testimonial is actually cut off over here to the side of the screen. We also want to ensure that we have the right max width on these. It looks like we have max width extra small, so that is working as we want it to. And we want to ensure that we have a couple of other things in place. One of them is pushing the testimonials from our description. So on our wrapping div, we're going to say MT10 to push it down by that 40 pixels that we need. And then we want to add a mask image to ensure that the testimonials look like they're just flowing off of the screen. And that's going to come in at our top wrapping parent div. So we're going to say mask image, and that's going to be a linear gradient, and it's going to go from the left to the right. So we're going to say to right. It's going to go transparent to black at 20% to black at 80%. So between 20 and 80%, showing basically the mask image is showing everything between 20 and 80%. And then it's going to smoothly hide everything when it goes back to transparent at 100%. So we have that in place. Let's see if that works correctly. And when we save that, we can see that it does smoothly transition that testimonial on and off the screen, which is exactly the effect that we wanted for this particular section. So far, I think this section is looking beautiful, but we want to make sure that at the tablet and the desktop size, we're seeing the same thing as well. So let's go over to our tablet size and see what adjustments we're going to have to make for this tablet size. I'm going to close out of my sidebar, and I'm going to open up my tablet view to get a bigger view of that tablet size screen. So I'm just going to pull that down to make sure it's still 100% and look at this section again. The first thing that sticks out is that this description is a little too wide. So let's see if there's something we can do about that. And it looks like indeed there is. Let's come back up to our description and let's add a max width on that as well. So I'm going to say max width small. That should ensure that it doesn't stay too wide, but then it goes over to the left side of the screen. So MX Auto will fix that by adding the margin left and margin right auto. Our title isn't too small, but it is a little bit small according to the design. So let's at the medium size, make sure we have text 6XL set, and that should ensure that we have the right text size set for our title for this section. The other thing that's going to change for this tablet view is we're going to change the size of the testimonial cards themselves. So they're going to have a little bit more padding. They're going to have a little bit of a different font size. So let's go ahead and make those adjustments as well. The first thing I see is the padding. It's going to go from a 24 pixel padding to a 40 pixel padding. So at medium, we're going to say P10, and that's going to give it the extra padding that we need there. We're also going to change the max width of these at this size. So instead of max width extra small at the medium size, we're going to go with max width medium, and that's actually going to give it a 448 pixel max width to give it plenty of space for these testimonials to show up in our bigger screen. The other thing that we'll want to do is want to change the text size itself. So right here we have text large, that's going to go to a text 2XL. So I'm going to say medium text 2XL, and that should ensure that we have the right font size there. I want to see if there's anything else that we need to do at this medium size. And right now I'm not seeing anything else right offhand, which means I think we are wrapping up our tablet size. Let's go ahead to the desktop size and see if there's anything that needs to change over there. At the desktop size, I'm going to pull this out just a little bit more so we can get a little bit of a better view. And one thing I did notice is that we don't have enough space at the bottom after this section, and that's because we forgot to change the section padding at the tablet size actually. So let me go to medium PY24, and that should give it the 96 pixels instead of just the 80 pixels of space that we have for this particular section. The other thing that I didn't realize that we hadn't addressed was the font size, but it's really obvious after we get to the desktop. We're going from a text large to a text XL here, but we're actually doing that at the medium size as well. So let's say text XL, and that should pull up the size of that text just a little bit more. And I think that does it for our desktop size. So what I'm going to do is pull out the browser all the way. We're going to go to our horizontal view, by hitting H as the shortcut key for that. I'm going to scroll over to my mobile view and start there and see if we broke anything in our testimonials as we were working through our responsive views. It doesn't look like it. This section is looking amazing. It's looking exactly as we want it to. The testimonials are fading in and off the screen. They're showing at the right size. And of course we did the great filter effect to get our images to show up in line with what we're seeing in the design. So this has been a really great section for us to work on. Now that we're done with this one, at least for the static part of this section, let's move on to the next section of the page. Now that we're moving on past our testimonials section, that means we need to go down to the call to action section. This is an interesting section because we're bringing back in our glowing button. We have a title and description that we're used to, but this is going to have some really cool effects on it after we're all said and done. We're going to have some pointer effects. We're going to have some parallax effects. This is going to be a really great section to just catch attention and bring people's eyes to our glowing button at the end of the page. So in the tablet view, you can see it's just a little bit smaller. And in the mobile view, we do get a smaller version of this section, but this is once again going to be an impressive part of the page for someone to be able to look at once it's all said and done, even though it's not all that hard when it comes to actually coding it up and creating the styles for this section. So let's go ahead and dive into our code without further ado. In order to dive into the code for our call to action, let's go into sections/call to action. And like our other sections, we have a div that's just outputting some text. So let's hook that up to our page by going to app/page, and then we're going to import our call to action section from @section/call to action and drop it into the bottom of our page with this call to action component right here. As soon as we save that, if our page refreshes automatically, which it has, we can see call to action section is now displayed at the bottom of the page. Everything is hooked up correctly, which means it's time to dive into the code for this call to action section. Now we're going to start with our semantic section tags. I'm going to say section right here, and then we're going to have a div for our container. Inside of that, we're going to have an H2, and that H2 is going to say something to the effect of AI-driven SEO for everyone. And then with our paragraph for our description, it's going to say achieve clear, impactful results without the complexity. And it's going to have a period at the end of that. Okay, so we see that on the page, and then we also have our button here. Now we already have a button component that we've created, so I'm going to import that. I'm going to import button from @/component/button, and we're going to drop this right here as our button component, and it's going to say join waitlist, and that should bring that in as well. Now that we have our content on the page, it's time to move on to our styles. For styling our section, the first thing we're going to do is go ahead and add our top and bottom padding for this section. So I'm going to come in here and say class name equals PY20. That's going to add the top and bottom padding that we need for this section. I'm going to come into this and make sure we have class name equals container. I actually didn't put that on here originally because I wanted you to see what happens when we don't put that container on here. That container is pushing our text from the sides of the screen and ensuring that we have the proper spacing there. So that's what that container is doing. I wanted to make that obvious, so I went ahead and left that off, and then now we're adding that container on. And then inside that container, we know that there's going to be another div because we're going to wrap all of our content for this section in a border, and we're going to have some backgrounds here as well. So I'm going to say class name equals, and then we're going to say border white, and I believe it's going to be a border white of 15. So I'm going to say border white /15 so that it has the 15% opacity that we need. Now for the top and bottom padding on this section, we're going to say PY24, and that's going to add 96 pixels of top and bottom padding to the actual content of the section as well. Moving on to our title, we're going to say class name equals, and that's going to be a text 5XL. In order to make that the right size, we're going to bring in the letter spacing with tracking tighter to pull that in a little bit. We're going to say text center to ensure that it's centered on the screen. And we want to say font medium, and that's going to ensure that we have the right font weight for our title. For our description, we'll add a class name here as well. And like our other descriptions on this page, we're going to say text center to ensure that it's centered on the page, text large to ensure that it's the right size, text white 70 to ensure that it's 70% opacity, and we want to give it a little bit of padding left and right with px4. That's ensuring that it stays the right size and doesn't touch the sides of this container. To move it down from our title, we'll say mt5 to give it the 20 pixels of margin top. And we also want this to have a little bit of tracking or letter spacing adjustment as well with tracking tight. And that should hopefully wrap up our mobile styles for that description. For our button, it's the easiest thing to do is going to be to wrap it in another div in order to adjust kind of spacing and all of that. So I'm going to wrap it in that div. I'm going to say class name equals, and we're just going to go ahead and flex it to the center with flex justify center. That should achieve that. And then we want to just space it out with MT5. And I hope that gives it the right amount of spacing to the top. It looks like it's a little bit different. Change that to MT8, and that should do the trick. For our background for this section, we want to make sure that that is set as well. So that's going to be on the div. We're going to set the background for this div is going to be the stars. So I'm going to say a style equals, and we're going to need to bring in our stars BG. So I'm going to scroll up to the top of the page, make sure we import our stars BG from @/assets/stars.png, and we're going to say style equals background image, and that's going to be our URL, and we're going to bring in that stars bg image.source, and that should at least put that background image on our page. It's actually going to start off by tiling it over the section, which is exactly what we want, and the background size should be 100% by default as well, which is exactly what we want. So we're actually not going to change the styles for that background image. We're just going to leave it alone and let it do what it does by default. We want to put a little bit of border radius on this section as well. So we're going to say rounded XL, and that should ensure that we have the right amount of border radius on this, as well as overflow hidden will ensure that as we move on to doing some different things with the background of this, that we don't see any problems with that. In order to add that grid line overlay that we see in this section, we probably want to add relative to here so that we can add an absolute position element behind all of our content. So I'm going to say div class name equals, and this is going to be absolute inset 0. That should make it the size of our content div. And then we want to give this a background as well. So we're going to say inside of our class name, our BG, and this is going to be RGB 74 32 138, and that should give it the custom background color that we want. Excuse me, that's not dashes, those are commas. There we go, that gives it the custom background color that we want. And then we also want a background image of the grid lines themselves. So I'm also going to add a style to this div, and for that we're going to say background image, and that's going to have the grid lines BG. So I'm going to say import grid lines from @assets/gridlines.png, and we're going to bring that in with URL gridlines.source as well. Now, in order to blend these two backgrounds together, we can do more color mixing and filtering that modern browsers allow us to do. And all we need to do is add on BG blend overlay, and that gives it a background blend mode. So essentially what a background blend mode is it takes multiple backgrounds and it blends them together using a particular filter. So we have multiple backgrounds on this particular div. We have a color and we have a URL for our backgrounds. So as soon as we hit save on this, that should blend those two together, our white grid lines with our purple background, to make the effect that we see here. Now, of course, there's a couple more things that we'll need to do in order to get our content to show up correctly and to get these grid lines to not show over this entire section, because we only want them showing near the top of the page behind our title. So the first thing I'm going to do is wrap all of our content in a div so that we can set that to relative and make it sure it shows up over any absolutely positioned elements. So class name equals relative. That should ensure that our content shows back up. And then for this background, we're going to add a mask image to it as well to ensure that it's only showing up on part of our section. So I'm going to say mask image here, and it's going to have a radial gradient. And inside that radial gradient, it is going to be 50%, 50%. So that's the size, 50%, 50%, at 50% from the left and then 35% from the top. That should ensure that it's at the right position and size. And then we're going to go from black to transparent, and that should add the effect that we need for this particular masked image. And as you can see, as soon as we do that, it gives it that really nice, really smooth fade out from the top of the page. We see a little bit of grid line behind our title, but we see a lot more of the stars around this section. So that's looking really, really good. I like how this has ended up. Let's go ahead and take a look at our different responsive styles and see what else we'll need to change for those. Coming into the tablet view, let's go ahead and scoot our browser out so we can see this full size. I'm going to put in my sidebar so I can see my code a little bit better, and then we'll see what we need to change here. So the first thing I'm seeing is we need to change our font size, of course. That's going to be text 6XL at the medium size. So we'll say medium text 6XL, and that should make sure that the font size is adjusted as it should be. And we'll also want a max width on this title as well. So I'm going to say max width small, and that should ensure that the title is the right size, but then we need MX Auto to push it back towards the center of the page. The same thing is true of the description. We're going to change the font size for this as well. So I'm going to say medium text XL for this one, and we're also going to have a max width extra small in this case. And then it's going to say MX Auto as well to ensure that it gets pushed back towards the center of the page. The only other thing that I noticed from the design is that for this section, we're going to say medium PY24 to ensure that this section has a little bit more padding on the top and bottom, although we don't change our padding inside of our section. That's going to stay our 96 pixels for the entirety of these responsive views. Now that we have our tablet size taken care of, let's look at our desktop size and see if there's anything else that we need to do here. So I'm going to pull this out so we can see it a little bit better. Let's see if we can get it to 100% size. And I'm looking at it, I'm not seeing anything that we need to do at this desktop size according to the design. I'm seeing a perfect background here. I'm seeing the text is the right size, the padding is the right size. So everything looks good at our desktop size, which means we just need to go to our horizontal view. I'm going to hit H on my keyboard to go to my horizontal view, and that should allow us to see that horizontal view and see all of our responsive views side by side. So as we scroll down, it actually matches up our scroll, of course, as well. So as we scroll down to our call to action, we can see that it's looking great on mobile. It looks great on tablet, and on desktop, it's looking great there as well. With that all wrapped up, it's time to move on to the last part of our static page before we go into the animations. Now, from a design perspective, the last section of our page is our footer, and it's not super complex. We have a logo and a title, we have a navigation bar with some nav items, and we have some social icons. As we move into our tablet view, you can see that it starts to stack top to bottom, and it stays aligned to the left. And then as we move into our mobile view, the same stays true. It's just that the container is a little bit smaller. So there's nothing too crazy here, not too much that we're going to have to worry about, but let's go ahead and complete our page by diving into the code. Coming back to our code, let's go into sections/footer.tsx, and we can see that it outputs this footer section div. So we need to go into our app/page and pull this in to our home page. So I'm going to import footer from @/section/footer, drop this into my home page like so. And as soon as we save that, hopefully we'll see the footer section there. We do, which means that we're all tied up and ready to go. For our footer section, let's go ahead and get the content on the page. So we're going to use a semantic footer tag. Inside of that footer tag, I'm going to give my div to hold all of my content. And then inside that, I'm going to make sure that we have 3 divs for every content part. So we're going to have our left, our center, and our right div. Inside of our left div, we're going to have our logo. So let's go ahead and import that. I'm going to import my logo image from @/assets/logo. And I can see it's actually an SVG, so I can import that a little bit differently. I'm actually going to call this my logo component, and I can just directly import that logo component right here. Beside my logo, I know that I'm going to have the name of this landing page. So I'm just going to make a simple div for that. I'm going to say AI startup landing page, and that's going to ensure that that content is there. Let me save that and ensure that that shows up. Our image is way too big, but that's fine for now. We'll go back and adjust that here in a second. Under this div, we'll go ahead and add a semantic nav tag, and we'll have 5 different links. So ahref equals a hash, and we'll go ahead and do that 5 times. And then for each of those, we'll go ahead and fill in with features. The next one is developers. The third one is company. Fourth is blog. And then the 5th is going to be changelog. So we'll have all of those 5 nav items. Those are showing up just fine. And then in our final div, we're going to have our social icons. So we know that these are SVGs, and we know that we can import them the same way. So I'm going to import my X social from @/assets/socialx. I'm going to import my InstaSocial from @/assets/social Instagram, and then I'm going to import my YT social from @/assets/YouTube social. Okay, so that's those 3 icons. Let's see how they look on the page. Let me go ahead and say X social as a component. Beside that, we're going to put our Insta social, and then beside that, we're going to create our YT social icon. If everything works, we should see those icons on the page, and indeed we do, which means our content is on the page, and that means it's time to dive into the styles. For this section, we'll start with our footer styles, and we'll say class name equals. Now it needs a little bit of padding top and bottom, so we'll say py5. That should create the 20 pixels of padding that we need top and bottom. We also have a border on the top, so we're going to say border T to create the border on the top, and then we'll color it with border white /15. That should make sure that the border is the right color. Coming down into our content, we'll go ahead and give this a class name of container. That will ensure that our content stays tied to that container. And then we need to ensure that we have these 3 separate divs flexed next to each other. So I'm going to actually wrap these in one div, and that div is what I'm going to use to control the content inside. So I'm going to say class name equals flex. And for now, because we're working on the mobile view, we'll say flex call. That will ensure that we're going top to bottom. As we move into our logo part of this, we're going to give this a class name of h6 width 6, and that will ensure that this is the right size logo. And then for our AI startup landing page, we just need to make sure that the class name is set to font medium to ensure that we have the right sized text there. To get these side by side, we'll go ahead and take this div and flex it as well. So class name equals flex, and then that will be a gap of 2 to get those to be adjusted correctly. And we'll say items center to ensure that they're aligned on the y-axis, which it looks like they already were, and that is fine. For our navigation, we'll of course want to flex these as well. So the nav is going to have a class name of, and we'll go ahead and say flex call. That will ensure that they're flexed to the column direction. We're going to give these a gap of 5 to ensure that there's 20 pixels of spacing in between them. And then we want to have a little bit of spacing in between this and the last section, but we can actually control this at this flex level because they're going to have the same amount of space in between all of these columns. So I'm going to say gap 8, that's going to give it 32 pixels of spacing in between, and that's going to be exactly what we need. For each of these items, these are each going to have a class name. I'm going to use a little bit of IDE magic to go ahead and add these all at once. I'm going to say class name equals, and we're going to say text white /70, which is white with 70% opacity, but when they're hovered, we want these to change to text white. We also want to make sure that the font size is correct, so we'll say text extra small, and that will ensure that they are the 12 pixels that it shows in the design at the mobile size. Now it looks like we don't need this extra wrapping div. We're not doing anything with it, so I'm actually going to remove that wrapping div around this nav and just let the nav be what it is. It shouldn't change anything about our page. Moving down into our social icons, let's go ahead and flex these as well. So class name equals flex, that should put them side by side. We'll say gap 5 to split them by 20 pixels. And we'll also ensure that they are all the right color. So I'm going to go ahead and use IDE magic again to give them a class name of text white 40. So this is one we haven't used yet, but it's white with 40% opacity. And then when they get hovered, once again, they're going to be text white. We'll add a transition here as well to ensure that when we hover those, that you have a little bit of a transition in between those states instead of a more jarring animation, which we currently have on our links. So I'm going to go ahead and add a transition to each of these as well by just going ahead and using that IDE magic to do that as well. So transition should add a transition to all of those items in the navigation in the footer. Now that we're done with our mobile styles for this footer section, let's go ahead and move on to our tablet view and let's see what else we'll need to adjust. I'm going to pull out my tablet view, get it to around 100%, and then we're going to use this button up here to make sure we shut off our sidebar so that we can see our code with a little bit more room to breathe. At this size screen, it looks like really the only thing that's going to change is we're going to have a different font size for our navigation. So instead of text extra small, now we're going to move to text small. Let me go ahead and select all of my text extra smalls here using Command D on the Mac, and I'm going to say medium. It's going to change to text small, and that should make sure that my text is the right size at this navigation size. That looks like it's working well. I'm not seeing anything else at the tablet size that we need to adjust according to the design. So let's go ahead and move on to the desktop screen and see if there's anything else that we see over there. And of course, at the desktop size, we no longer want our navigation or our footer being stacked top to bottom. Now we want it being displayed left to right. So I'm going to change this flex column, our wrapper around all of our columns. I'm going to change that to, at a large size, flex row, and that should show it side by side, which indeed it does. Of course, there's a couple of other changes that we need to make as well. We're also going to say items center to ensure that our items are centered on the Y axis. This will also need to change at this size. We'll say large flex row here as well, and we'll ensure that we have the right amount of gap at this size. It doesn't look like we do. We're going from a gap 5 to a gap 7, so I'm going to say large gap 7, and that should ensure that we have 28 pixels of spacing in between our navigation items. We want to ensure that each of our divs is flexed the same size, so we're going to say large flex 1 on each of these to ensure that we have them all flexed correctly. Large flex 1 on our second one, and then going down to our third div, we're going to say large flex 1 here as well, and that should ensure that we have all those flexed correctly. Now we're also going to be justifying these slightly differently at this size as well, because we want our social icons to be justified to the right. Let me go ahead and zoom in on this a little bit more so we can see this a little bit better. Let's see if we can get this all the way out to 100%. I don't want to quite go that far because we still need to work in our code. So at this size, this column is going to be justified to the end. So I'm going to say large justify end, and that should move that over there. And then the center column is going to be justified to the center. So I'm going to say large justify center, and that will hopefully move that column over to the center. And that should wrap up the end of our page. So let me go ahead and slide this all the way out to ensure that we see this 100% at full size. We're going to go to the horizontal view, and then we're going to scroll through this part of the page and ensure we didn't break anything. And I'm seeing that we actually do have some things that aren't quite aligned the way that we want them to be. So we need to ensure that that is taken care of as well. So let me scroll back in here. That's why we do this horizontal view, is so we can see and make sure we didn't break any of our responsive views as we're going through our different sizes. So it looks like this items center is the problem. We only want this to apply at the large size. So let me go ahead and say large item center and see if that fixes our footer. And indeed, it looks like it does. After I saved, I'm seeing this scoot back over, and then at the large size, we're seeing everything being aligned correctly. So this is exactly what we wanted to see. And of course, as always, we're glad that we are using this responsive browser to be able to check and make sure that we didn't break anything without having to go through every single view on Chrome or something like that. This just works a lot better for doing responsive coding. Now that our entire page is looking excellent, it's time to move on to our animations, which are really going to take our page to the next level. So for each one of the sections that you see on the page, besides maybe the footer or the navigation at the top, we're going to add amazing animations that are going to impress both clients as well as people that might be seeing this as part of a resume or a portfolio, this is going to be an impressive site. So we're going to go through each one of these sections and add the animations next. So make sure you stick around for the entirety of that. Now that we've completed the static portion of our page, it's time for us to add animation to bring every section alive. Now, primarily for this part of the build, we're going to work from the tablet view because the tablet view is going to offer us the best compromise between a small size that we can see so we have plenty of room for our code and a large enough size to be able to actually see what's going on the page. So we'll still check it in mobile and desktop, but for this part, we're going to be working from the tablet view. Now, that being said, let's go ahead and talk about the component library that we're going to use in order to bring motion into this page. And that's going to be Framer Motion. As I go ahead and just make this a little bit bigger so that we can see this a little bit better, I'm going to bring up my Browse tab once again, and we're going to talk about this Framer Motion and what that will allow us to do. So as we look at Framer Motion, we can see that we can install it just by installing Framer Motion, and it is a React library that allows us to add specific components and create easy animations with those components without doing a lot of intense JavaScript code. So we'll go ahead and import our motion from Framer Motion. This will be the components that we can replace specific elements with. So if it's a div, we can replace it with motion.div, and we can add the motion elements to that or motion props to that. And you can see that it becomes very easy to animate. If we just want to move our exposition by like 100%, we can use this animate prop, and that will allow us to do that. This is animate prop is going to be the ending position that we want our motion div to go to. And we'll do a lot of kind of fancy tricks with Framer Motion, but this is just kind of giving you this brief overview of how this works. And of course, we can do a lot of different things with just being able to change the props of this, and you can see it, and that gives it that nice springy feel. It's going to make our animations feel so smooth and fluid. And of course, the other thing you have to worry about with animations is, of course, ensuring that they are performant, which means that you're seeing them at 60 frames per second without lag or without the browser having issues. And that's going to be due to the way that Framer Motion works. It's going to ensure that it's not continuing to cause React to re-render because of the way that it works. All kind of stuff you can do with gestures, you can do scroll triggered, server-side rendering, motion values. There's a ton that we can get into with Framer Motion. And of course, we're going to be animating all of our page with Framer Motion. So of course, we'll get to explore a little bit more of this. Let's quickly look at animation overviews in case you don't yet fully understand how Framer Motion is going to work. So what we're going to be doing is replacing any of our divs we want to animate or any of our elements that we want to animate with these motion elements. And then we're going to use the props to go ahead and animate those. And then we can control how that transition happens with the options that are provided us with the transition prop. So this means that basically in this case, we're moving this over in the X position by 100 pixels. We're going to add an ease to that, and we're going to have that happen over 2 seconds. So this is a very low code way to make that animation happen. We have ways to do enter animations when they enter on the screen. We have exit animations. We can even do different keyframes where we have things change throughout the animation. So we can do all of that. All of this is provided to us through Framer Motion. And of course, this is one of the reasons that we build in React, is because we want the ability to bring in these great libraries that are pre-built for us that really add a lot of capability to our coding without a lot of extra work. That is one of the big advantages of building this in React. So without further ado, let's go ahead and close this Browse tab out, and let's talk about what we're going to do to this hero section to bring it alive. One of the first things that you'll notice about this hero section is that we will want these rings around our planet to rotate to really make this feel like things are going on in this section. So I'm going to have these rings rotating. In fact, the inner ring, the ring 1, is going to be rotating to the right or clockwise. The next ring up is going to be rotating counterclockwise, and then the third ring is going to be rotating clockwise again. And if we set these to different speeds, we'll see that these are just going to look like this, kind of have this random rotation going on, but it's going to be definitely controlled with Framer Motion. The other thing we're going to animate that's not going to be as obvious, you may not have even noticed this during the presentation of this site, is that we're going to animate the star background. The stars are going to be slowly moving to the right, and they're going to have a parallax effect, which means that as we scroll down, the stars are not going to move directly with our scroll. They're actually going to move a little bit slower. So it almost looks like you're seeing things out deep into space, which is exactly the impression that we're trying to create with this section. It's subtle animation, but it is definitely animation that brings this section alive. So without further ado, let's go ahead and dive into the hero section of our page. I'm going to open up our tablet view to make sure that it's at 100%. Now that we're out of that browse tab, and let's go ahead and open up our hero section and see what we're going to have to change in this hero section to get this to work. In any section that we do, that we bring Framer Motion into, we're going to have to make sure that it is a client component. And that is because Next.js requires any state or anything like that. Anytime we're using any client interaction, it requires us to use client so that it doesn't server render that. It actually client renders that and allows us to use some of the things that we're bringing in. And then we're going to import our motion from Framer Motion. And that's going to allow us to get started. Now, the first thing I'm going to start to animate is these rings. So we have our planet and we have this start of ring 1. So in order to animate this one, I'm going to replace this with a motion.div, and that's going to allow this to be animatable with Framer Motion. So let me go ahead and have my ending motion.div there. When we save, nothing happens because we haven't added any animation to it yet, but of course we're about to. So what we want to do is we want to animate the turn or the rotation of this particular div. So we're going to say rotate, and then we're going to say one turn, and that's going to rotate it 360 degrees. Now, as soon as I save that, you're going to see that happen. Well, it's going to move it and it's going to do that rotation really quickly. Neither of those things are things that we want to happen. And the reason it moves it is because we have a translate already being set. And if you know about CSS, you'll know that a translate is actually part of the transform, or excuse me, right here. It's part of the transform rule. So the transform controls translation, it controls rotation, skews, scales. So all of that gets stuck under one rule, which means that if we change one of those parts, we're going to have to make sure that we bring these rules along as well. So what we're going to do is basically just say that our style is going to also include the translations that we've done. So we're going to say translate Y negative 50% and translate X negative 50%, and that'll ensure that we're not overriding those rules as we're adding in our animation. So let me save this again, make sure that our ring gets moved back to the right place, which it does, but it's still way too fast with the animation. It's hard to even see it. Let me see if I can refresh and we can actually see this happen. Yeah, it's really, really quick, which means we need to slow this down with our transition properties. So let me go ahead and add a transition prop, and we're gonna say that the duration for this particular animation is going to be, let's start with 30 seconds and just see what that looks like. I'm going to save that again, and we're going to refresh our page, and you can see that that's happening. It's actually looking pretty good. I don't mind that speed, but of course, as soon as we get to the end of those 30 seconds, as you're going to see here in just a couple of seconds, it's going to slow down, and then it's slowly going to come to a stop. And of course, we don't want that to come to a stop at all. We want this to be just a linear rotation that continues to go on and on and on. So we're going to set the repeat to infinity, which is a JavaScript number value. And we're also going to set the ease to linear, and that's going to create the transition that we want. So as soon as I save that, I'm going to refresh this again, and let's see if we see this happening like we want to. And indeed, it looks like it is happening. It looks really nice right now. So I'm going to leave that as is. I really like how that's showing up. So let's go ahead and move on to our next transition that we want to add. The next transition we're going to add is to our ring 2. So let's change this to emotion.div as well. Let me see if I have an ending div over here. I do, so let me change that to emotion.div and ensure that we have a motion div for that ring 2. Now for this ring 2, we're going to transition it in the opposite direction. So we know that we're going to need to add an animate prop. We also know that we're going to need to add a transition prop to be able to control the transition. And we also know that because this is going to be translated as well or transformed as well, that we're going to need to add another style prop to this to ensure that we have our correct styles. So let me go ahead and copy and paste the translation styles to this to ensure that it doesn't move out of place as soon as we add our rotation. We're going to rotate this, and the rotation is going to be, in this case, negative one turn. And then we're going to do this with the infinity repeat as well. So we're going to say repeat infinity. I'm going to say the duration in this case is going to be 60. I'm happy with that. Actually, let's see if we can make this 30. Let's try that for starters, and then we'll make the ease linear as well. So let's go ahead linear and see how that looks. Now that 30 is a little fast. We can't even hardly see because we have this dashed outline. It's very, very difficult for us to actually be able to see this. So I'm going to slow that down to 60 and see if that looks any better. And we go ahead and refresh my page to see that animation take effect. And indeed, that looks much better. So I like that 60 slowdown. Let's see if this looks any better at 60 as well. So let me go ahead and change this up here, the first ring 1 to 60, refresh my page and see if I like that any better as well. And it's more subtle, but I think I like it a little bit better just because it's eye-catching, but it does add a little bit more subtlety to this section. So I'm going to keep it at that duration of 60 seconds. I really like that. Okay, and then the last one is going to be ring 3. Change this to a motion.div as well. And of course our ending motion.div. Save that, and we're going to do some of the same similar things. So I can actually copy and paste all of these motion.div props that I'm using here. And let's see, in this case, it's actually going to be clockwise. We're going to say 1 turn. Infinity linear is going to be correct. And then the duration is just going to be whatever we want it to be. So let's try slowing it down. Let's try and slow it down and see how that looks. It's going to be hard to see this one because this one is actually this outer ring right here. So I might switch over to the desktop view after I refresh and see if we can get a better view of how that looks. So let me switch over to the desktop view. Let me pull this out a little bit. And yes, indeed, we can see that that is moving, and it's moving at a different speed than our inner ring. And I like it being a little bit slower than our inner ring because, of course, that's an outer rotation, so it's going to take a little bit longer. Now that our rings are spinning, let me move back to the tablet view. Let's scoot this back in again, and let's talk about our stars and how we can animate those in a parallax effect. So I'm going to come up to my stars. My stars are going to be set on my section background. So that means we're actually going to need to create our entire section as a motion section, which is really interesting, not something I've done before. But let's go ahead and try it. So I'm going to say motion.section here because we can replace any element that we have, any normal HTML JSX element we can replace with a motion element. And I'm going to come down to the bottom of my section and say motion.section, ending motion.section there, and save that and see if anything changes. It doesn't look like it does right offhand, which is exactly what I would expect. And then we need to add in some sort of animation to say what happens with these stars. The first thing we're going to do is not add any kind of parallax effect yet. Let's just make them go from left to right at a slow speed. So how I'm going to do that is I'm going to go ahead and make sure that we're changing our background position in both the X and Y direction. So that is going to look like giving this an animate prop. And then for the animate, we're going to say background position X, and that is going to be equal to 100% of my background image. So that's actually going to be equal to our stars bg.width. So we want to take the width of this and say that our X value is going to animate from 0 to the full width of the stars. That should allow a repeating animation that looks completely smooth. So let's go ahead and take that stars bg.width, and that does a really quick one-time animation, which is not what we want. So we'll control that with a transition. So I'm going to add my transition prop, transition, and that's going to have a repeat value of infinity. We're of course going to have an ease of linear to make that happen linearly. And then the duration is going to be really slow. It's going to be 120. So that it's going to happen over 2 minutes. So let's go ahead and refresh our page and see how this is working right now. And that looks incredible. It's a very subtle animation, but it does add just a little extra touch to this hero section to make it just really come alive. So the stars are moving from left to right. Now they're doing it very slowly. Now to add the depth that we want, we're going to actually track the scroll position, and then we're going to use that to say how they're positioned on the y-axis. In order to track the scroll position, Framer Motion gives us a tool for that as well. So we're going to bring in use scroll, and use scroll will allow us to change our animations based on the current scroll position of the user. Now to do that, we're going to bring in our use scroll hook, and we're going to say that the target is going to be equal to whatever we're trying to target, whatever we want to track the scroll position of. In this case, we're going to be tracking the scroll position of the section itself. So I need to add a ref to it so that we have a way to access the DOM element for this section. So I'm actually going to bring in use ref as well. So I'm going to say const section ref is going to be equal to use ref from React, and that is going to have a default value of null. And then we're going to tie this to our motion section by saying ref equals section ref, and that should allow that to work. Now our target isn't hooked up yet, so our target is going to be section ref. And let's see if that brings it back to compilation, which it does. And then we'll need to give it an offset. An offset is just identifying this is going to go between 0 and 1, but where do we want 1 to be? Where do we want 0 to be? Essentially what we're going to say is when the start of this section is at the end of the page. So as we're scrolling up, it'll never actually get there because the page isn't tall enough for that to get there. But the start of the section reaches the end of the page till when the end of the section right down here reaches the start of the page. So around this position, that is going to be when we're going to track this 0 to 1 value. And then we're just going to say const scroll y progress is going to be equal to our use scroll. So we're going to grab scroll y progress. Scroll y progress is going to be essentially the percentage that we've scrolled this section from 0 to 1. And then when we have that value, we can then transform that value in order to give us that parallax effect. So in order for us to see what's actually going on here, what number scroll y progress is equal to, let's go ahead and use something else that Framer Motion gives us, which is use motion value event. So let's say use motion value event, and that will allow us to say, okay, when the scroll y progress value changes, then we can get the value of it and we can just console log it out. So console.log, we'll just say scroll y progress, and then we'll give it that value. So all we're doing is basically saying, okay, anytime this value changes, just go ahead and console log this in our console so that we can see what that value is actually going to be. So if I bring up my console, I'm going to bring up my bottom bar here, go to edit and go to console, and then I'm going to put this down a little bit and then see if we scroll what we see happening here. And we can see that as we scroll, we start to see the different scroll y progress values, and it should get all the way, hopefully all the way up to 1, which indeed we do see. So when that section exits the page, it's going to be 1, and it's going to be 1 until we scroll back to that section, at which point we'll start counting down again as we get through the scroll of that particular section. So that's what scroll y progress gives us. Now that we know that, we can go ahead and remove that, and we can make sure that we're transforming it a little bit. So what we want to happen is we want to use something else that Framer Motion gives us called use transform. So we're going to transform those values of 0 to 1 to different values so that we can use this to animate our background position Y. So let's see how we do that. We'll bring in the use transform hook. The use transform is going to take in scroll Y progress, and as that transitions from 0 to 1, we're going to transition our value from -300 to 300. And then we'll use that as const background position Y. What we're going to call that, we're going to call this background position Y, and that's basically going to just take any value between here and just translate it to a much bigger range of values. So when we're at 0.5, we're actually going to be at 0. When we're at 0, we're going to be at -300, and when we're at 1, we're going to be all the way up to 300. So that's just going to translate these values over like we're seeing here. In order to add that in, we're just going to add a style of background position Y. So background position Y is going to be equal to that value between -300 and 300. So we're just going to transition that as we scroll. So let's see how this works and if it is a great effect. So let me scroll down a little bit, and you can see that our stars are actually barely moving, and that's because they're actually moving up with the scroll. so that they look like they're staying a lot more in position or a lot more static to the scroll of the page. So it's giving it that depth of showing the planet over the stars instead of that the stars are just there. Just that little bit of depth just really adds another level of polish and life to this hero section. Now that's everything we want to do with the hero section as it relates to animations, which means let's move on to the logo ticker and let's talk about the animations over there. Okay, we've just gotten done with animating our hero section, which looks amazing right now. Now let's go on to the next section of the page and see what kind of animation we want to do for this. So for this section, we're going to bring up our logo ticker and we're going to talk about what we need to do in order to make this an animated section. So the first thing we're going to need to think about is we want these logos to transition from the left position that they're in right now to the right. But of course, if we were to move these over right now, it wouldn't work all that well. And let's demonstrate this real quick. We're going to say translate X 8, and we can see that the logos start to move over, and let's go up to 16, and then to 20, and then to 40. And we can see that the logos continue to move over, but of course there's no logos to follow them behind to ensure that we have an infinite scroll animation. So in order to have other logos, in order for this effect to work, we need to duplicate our logos so that we have another set of logos coming behind. And then after we translate them over to the right by 50%, we can bring them back to 0, translate them over by 50%, and it can look like this smooth infinite scroll animation. So that's what I'm going to try and create. We could map over this twice, creating like this fake array essentially, or this, just this array for mapping these over. But I don't want to confuse you. So all I'm going to do is go ahead and take our logo array and then just copy and paste it so that we have double the number of logos that we had before. Now, if we say negative translate X 1/2, we should see our Acme Corp as soon as we hit save. It should be in the same position if we're doing this the right way, if we have all the styles lined up the way we need to. And we're not actually seeing that happen. And that's because we have this flex none here, but that's not doing much because we don't have any kind of flex rule here. So let's go ahead and flex that. And then we have a little bit of spacing that we're not accounting for because we need the spacing in between the entire thing to have a little bit of padding to the right. So I'm going to say PR14, that is equal to our gap, and that's going to put a little bit of padding on the right that moves this in the right direction. Now, my translate X 1/2, if I have this set correctly, my negative translate X 0 and negative X translate 1/2 should look exactly the same. That tells us that we have this in position to be able to translate this correctly. And we're going to start from negative translate 1/2 and go to 0, and then go back to negative translate 1/2 and go to 0 again infinitely. So in order to do that, let's go ahead and bring in our motion div again. So I'm going to import motion from Framer Motion. We're going to change this to a motion.div in order to animate this line of images. So motion.div there at the bottom. Nothing should change yet. And then we need to add in our animate. And of course, as soon as we save that, we need to make sure that we say use client in the top of our component so that it renders correctly within Next.js. Always need to remember that. And then inside here, we need to go ahead and do our animation props. So here, we're actually going to use an initial prop because we want it to initially be set to negative 1/2, and it's going to go to 0. So I'm going to say initial equals translate X negative 50% or negative 1/2, and then it's going to go to an animate value of translate X 0, and that should make sure that it does the right thing. Of course, when we save this again and we refresh, it's going to happen really, really quickly. Let's see what happens here. Yep, of course, it's going to happen really quickly, and it's only going to happen once. So we use our transition prop to control that transition. So the repeat is going to be infinity. The duration is going to be 30 seconds, and the ease is going to be linear so that we never see a speed up or a slowdown in that animation. As soon as I've saved that, let's go ahead and refresh and see what we see here. And we can see that as the logos start going to the right, we have another set of logos coming behind them. That's what's going to make it look like an infinite transition. And then as soon as Acme Corp comes back around, here in a few seconds, it's actually just going to pop back and it's going to start at -50 again and go to 0. So it's just going to look like you have an infinite number of logos that are kind of come out of the left-hand side. But of course, we know that that's an illusion that we're creating. So yep, it came back around, and of course, it looks great. It looks really slick. Looks really amazing. Let's go ahead and look at this on the mobile and desktop size and make sure everything looks as it should there as well. So let's go to mobile, scroll up here, and we can see that we don't see as many logos at one time, but it still is happening like we want it to. And then on the desktop view, we really get a great view of that particular section because we can see more logos. So this is looking really, really good. This is animated well. Let's go on to the next section so we can animate that as well. Now that we've animated our logo ticker, let's go ahead and move on to our features section and talk about the different animations that we're going to implement here. So one of the animations is going to be the selected tab animation, where we're going to have a rotating border that's going to show the selected tab. We're also going to animate each of these icons on hover. So when we hover over these tabs, we should see the icons animate individually. And then when we click on one of the tabs, we should see this background image here zoom into the right position. So those are the 3 animations that we're going to add into this features section. In order to do that, let's go ahead and dive into our features section and let's see what we'll need to do in order to make this happen. So one of the things that we're going to have to do is we're going to have to split our tab out to a separate component because we need to use a ref to be able to access each of the tabs underlying HTML elements. So in order to do that, let's go ahead and just copy and paste this. So I'm going to say X right here, or Command X on the Mac, and I'm going to say const feature tab is going to be equal to our component here, and we're going to just return the JSX that we just created. So here we're going to take in a tab. That tab is going to be equal to one of our array elements. So we can say that this is going to be equal to a type of tabs number, and that should bring in that tab itself. Now we don't need to add a key here because we are going to make sure that that key is added inside of each of our tabs here when we bring in our tab components. We're going to say tab feature tab here, and we're going to say that we're going to spread the tab props. So that's going to just basically add all of the props that we need here. And then we're also going to add a key of tab.title, and that should add the proper keys there. Let's see if that works by just going ahead and saving our page and seeing if anything changed. It should not have changed, which it doesn't look like it did, which looks like everything works as expected. Now the first thing we're going to tackle inside of our tab is going to be our .lottie animation. So we're going to say when the tab is hovered, so when this entire thing is hovered, we're going to want to play this animation. In order to get the player for this animation, we're going to need to give this a ref so that we can access that. So I'm going to come in here, I'm going to say const.lottie ref, and that's going to be equal to a use ref or React ref, which is going to have a default value of null if I'm not mistaken. Now, in order to attach this to the .lottie player, let's see, ref equals .lottie ref, and that should be able to attach that to our .lottie player. Now, if we access .lottie ref.current, we should be able to access the player itself. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add an on hover on this one. So I'm going to say on hover, and we're going to have something happen. We're going to say handle tab hover. So we're going to create a function that's going to handle tab hover. And actually, I don't need to say on hover here. I need to say on mouse enter because that's the actual event that we can handle. So let's go ahead and create our const for handle tab hover. So I'm going to say const handle tab hover, and that's going to be a function that runs, and we're going to then use this .lottie ref to go ahead and play our animation when that is hovered. So what we're going to do is we're going to say that .lottie ref.current .play, and that should play our animation. Now it's saying it could possibly be null, and that's of course true because it's not guaranteed that we have this ref on the page. So what we can do is we can say if .lottie ref.current is equal to null, then we just return. So we don't do anything if that happens. and of course play. Okay, so it says it doesn't exist on type never, and that's just because we need to make sure that we have the right type for that ref to understand what's going to be inside of there. So let's go ahead and say .lottie common player. That's going to be the type of that, and that's going to show that this does indeed have a play function that we can use. So let's save that and let's see if this works as expected. Let me go ahead and refresh my page, and we know that these animations play as soon as we come onto the page or refresh the page, but let's see what happens when we hover. And we're not seeing anything, and that's actually because the animation itself has already played. In fact, let's go ahead and take this autoplay prop out for a second by just commenting it out, and let's go ahead and refresh our page and see what happens when we hover these tabs. And we can see that it does actually play this time, but it only plays the first time, because after the animation has played, now it's at the end of the animation, so it doesn't have anything else to play. So all we need to do is come in here and say, we're going to use .lottieref.current.seek, and that seek should enable us to seek to the 0 position. So basically we're going to go back to the start of the animation, and then we're going to play it anytime this hovers. And of course we're going to put back our autoplay prop because we still want that to happen every time the page refreshes. So the page refreshes, the animations all happen, and then when we hover, it's going to seek back to 0, and then it's going to play our animation. So that's a really nice little trick that we can use, and that is how we use .lottie to control the animations based on other things that are happening on the page. So it's not even a hover of this that we're listening to, it's actually a hover of the tab itself that's just giving a little micro interaction, a little bit of joy to the user as they interact with this site. Now that we have each of our icons animated inside of our features section so that when we hover over them, we see them animate, this means that it's time to move on to the next part of this animation of this section, which is going to be to ensure that we are wrapping our selected div in a border that animates around the outside of that tab. So let's go ahead and see what we need to do in order to make this happen. The first thing I like to do when trying to create these types of animations is we can ensure that we can create the animation first statically, and then we just need to animate the position of that animation. So I'm going to create a div right here, and I'm going to give it a class name of absolute inset 0, and this is what we're going to add our border with. So we're going to give it a border color, say border, and then give it a color of, in this case, A369FF, and that should give it the correct color. And in order to see that, we'll of course need to make the actual tab relative. So I'm going to go ahead and say relative there, and that will make the border show up. Now, since absolutely positioned things go inside the border of the parent container, we actually need to pull this out by a single pixel in order to get it to overlay our border correctly. So I'm going to say -m pix, and that's going to pull that out by a single pixel. And to make it rounded as well, we'll say rounded XL so that it just matches the border of our element exactly. Now, to get it to only show up on part of the tab instead of around the entire thing, we're going to use a mask image. So I'm going to say mask image, and that's going to be a radial gradient, and that radial gradient is going to be 80 pixels by 80 pixels. And it's going to be at 0% for starters, 0%, and it's going to go from black to transparent, and that should enable that to show up just on one side of our tab. Now, of course, we don't have our selected tab yet. We're not going to worry about that yet. We're going to get the animation done, and then we're going to worry about only showing it on the selected tab. Now, in order for us to animate this, what we're going to have to do is we're going to have to animate these percentages. So I want this to go from 0% to 100% on the x-axis, and then we're going to go to 100% on the y-axis, and then we're going to go back to 0% on the x-axis, and then we're going to go back to 0% on the y-axis. So you can see that we're going kind of around this rectangle by just animating these percentages. So in order to do that within Framer Motion, that means we need to use something called a motion value. Because we're going to be kind of animating this externally, we need to use a motion value, and then we're going to dynamically set the style of this mask image based on those motion values. And since we need to animate two numbers, we're going to have to use two motion values. So the first one is going to be a X%, and we're going to set that equal to a use motion value, and that's going to start with 0. Now, use motion value comes from Framer Motion. Let me make sure I have that import just by going ahead and hitting enter on that, and that should import that at the top of my page, which of course it does. That looks good up there, so that works well. We also want to animate the Y motion value as well. So I'm going to say const Y%, and that's going to be equal to use motion value as well of 0. Now, in order to set this as a dynamic template, we need to take this and say use motion template. That way we can use these motion values dynamically inside of a mask image template. Now let's see how that works. I'm going to actually remove this here. So I'm going to go ahead and just cut this mask image value out, and I'm going to go ahead and pull in use motion template from Framer Motion as well. Now that Framer Motion template is just going to be a template literal, and we're going to paste in the value that we want there, and then we're going to set this to a value so we can use this. I'm going to set this to mask image, and it's going to be equal to use motion template. Now this is our Tailwind version of this. So we need to take out our underscores. So I'll go ahead and take those out real quick just by going ahead and doing that. But it's going to be 80 pixels at 0 X%, 0 Y%, and then go from black to transparent. Now we know that we don't want these 0% to be static, so we're going to change those out to be our motion values that we just created. So we're going to call this one X%. So I'm going to say X% here. And then for the next one, we're going to say Y% there. And that's going to ensure that these motion values get inserted into this template. And as these change, this template will get updated with our new mask image. Now, in order to make this div take our mask image and animate appropriately, it needs to be a motion div. So let's go ahead and go up to the top of our file, make sure we've imported motion, and then down here, we're going to go ahead and change this to a motion.div, and that's going to ensure that we can actually use these motion values that we're trying to create right here. We're going to remove this mask image rule, and we're going to set a dynamic style for this. So we're just going to say style equals, and mask image is going to be what it's equal to. And we can say mask image like that, but since they both have the same name, we could use the syntax where we just say mask image, and that should set our mask image on that particular div. Now, in order to see that this all works, let's statically go ahead and change these percentages. So if this X value is equal to 50, and we save that and refresh our page, we should see that yes, it does go over to 50. Same thing for a Y value. If let's say our X value was 100, the Y value was 50, we should see this over here in this corner. So let's refresh our page and see if that works. And yes, so we are seeing these motion values are dynamically getting inserted into our motion template. So now let's talk about how to actually animate these motion values. And to do that, we're going to say that as soon as the feature tab comes on the page, we're going to use what's called a use effect, which is a React hook that we can use to start animations when this feature tab comes on the page. So I'm going to say use effect. And that use effect is going to be a function that runs, and we're going to say that for now it's never going to change. And let me make sure that use effect is imported just by making sure that I hit enter on the right one there. And then when we do this, we're going to start animating our X and Y percentage inside our use effect. So when this component first loads, we're going to start our animations, and we do that with our animate function from Framer Motion. So we animate our X percentage, and we're going to give this a few different values, right? We're going to start at 0% for our X percentage. So we're going to go from 0 to 100 over on the right top corner, to 100 again. That's going to be this bottom corner over here, back to 0 on this left bottom corner, and then back to 0 again. So we're going to have 5 different values that we're going to animate. So we're going to go 0, 100, 100, 0, 0, and that's how we're going to do our animation. So 0, 100, 100, 0, 0. That's going to be how our X percentage is going to animate. And then we can also give it some options. So the options is going to be duration. We're just going to set that to 4 seconds right now. We also want to set it to repeat infinity. The ease is going to be linear because we're going to have it going around and around. We don't want to speed up or slow down. And then the repeat type is going to be loop, and that will make that happen again and again the way that we want it to. So let's see, we only animated so far the X percentage, and let's reset these back to 0, and let's just see how this looks when we save this and refresh our page. So I'm going to save this right now, and we see that yes, the X is going back and forth, and then when we add the Y value in, that will ensure that we also go up and down. So the X is handling our back and forth motion, the Y value will handle our up and down motion. So let's go ahead and animate the Y value as well. So I'm going to say animate Y percentage, and this one's going to be a little bit different because we're going to start at 0 on the Y percentage, but at the top right corner, the Y is still going to be 0, so it's going to go 0, 0, 100%, 100%, and then 0. So as it goes around, it's going to look a little bit different. 0, 0, 100, 100, 0. And that's going to take it around, and then we're going to give it the same options because we want it to happen over the same period of time. So duration is going to be 4. The repeat is going to be infinity. Ease, of course, is going to be linear, and the repeat type is going to be loop. Now, to make this more dry or do not repeat yourself, we can go ahead and take these options and put them into a single object that we can add to both of these animate calls. So I'm going to say const options, and that's going to be equal to an object, and I'm just going to copy and paste this object right here and paste it right into options, and then we can add options onto here. We can do the same thing down here. We'll add options onto the Y percentage. The reason it doesn't like these options is because they're not correctly typed according to TypeScript. So yes, they have the correct types, but it's not the type that it's expecting inside of this animate function. So we need to go ahead and add a value animation transition type onto here, and that will take away our TypeScript error there. So let's see how this works. Let me go ahead and refresh my page, and since we're animating both the X and Y values, we should see those animate now. So we do. Okay, we're seeing Y animating, we're seeing X animating, so it is going around the entire rectangle, but it's doing it very strangely because the Y animation and the X animation are taking the same amount of time, but there's a large difference between how much space we're covering on the Y axis versus how much space we're covering on the X axis. We want this animation to look more fluid and even as it's going up and down and as it's going left and right. In order to do that, we can do this, but it's going to take a little bit of work because we're going to have to measure this rectangle and actually see how much surface area we need to cover or how much circumference we need to cover. And then we're going to split this out and make sure that our transitions are happening at the right times so that we can animate this evenly. So in order to do that, let's go ahead and get what we need to measure, which is our wrapping div. So let's go ahead and say const tab ref, and that's going to be equal to use ref from React. It's going to have a default value of null. The ref type is going to be HTML div element, and that's going to be important when we get to measuring so we have the right functions on it. Then inside of our use effect, let's go ahead and add it on. So let's go ahead and say ref equals tab ref. And inside of our use effect, when it loads, we'll go ahead and do that measurement. So what we'll say is tab ref.current.get bounding client rect. That's going to give us the height and width of our tab ref, and then we can pull out of that the height and width, and this is going to be either a number or, as you can see, this might be undefined. So we have to ensure that's not going to be undefined by just saying if it is, if tab ref.current is, or if we don't have that yet, let's just go ahead and return nothing, and that will ensure that nothing actually happens. So now that we've measured our height and width, we can actually get our circumference and then make sure that our animation happens according to the times that we can time it up with the circumference. So I'm going to say const circumference, and that's going to be equal to height times 2 plus width times 2. And then we can add a times in here. I'm going to say const times, and we're going to give it basically percentages. So we want the percentage of time that we're going to cover with our X transition. We also want the percentage of time that we're going to cover with our Y transition. So we're going to go from 0 and it's going to end up with 1, but in between we need the values that are in between 0 and 1. So when we cover the first top of this, that's going to be equal to our width divided by our circumference. The second step is going to be when we've covered the value right here, And that's going to be equal to width plus height divided by circumference. Then at the third step, we need to go to width times 2 plus height. So width times 2 plus height divided by circumference. And this last step is going to be equal to 1. So we have our 5 different percentages, and then we have the times with which we're stopping at each of these stopping points. So I'm just going to add this into options. I'm going to say times, and that's something we can add in here to add our keyframe times. Now, when I save this and refresh our page, let's see if that has a much more linear feel to it. And indeed it does, because we told it, okay, for this keyframe, this is how much percentage of time I want it to take. And we did that based on the measurement of our tab, which is really incredible. And that really worked really well. So the final step of getting this particular animation done is we need to ensure that only the selected tab is the one showing the animation. So we're going to come down to our features section, and we need to save whichever tab is the selected tab. So I'm going to come in here, I'm going to say const selected tab, and then set selected tab. And we're just going to save an index here. So it's going to be a use state. We're going to use a React state, and we're just going to save 0 at first because it's going to be the first tab. So the indexes are going to be 0, 1, and 2. And then we can pull out the tab index here, and we can use that to say whenever this feature tab is clicked, let's go ahead and change our selected tab to the current tab index. So let's see if we can do that. We're going to say on click, and then we're going to pass it a function that's going to say when that happens, let's go ahead and set our selected tab to the current tab index. Now TypeScript is yelling at us because we don't have an on-click handler being passed into our feature tab. So if we come up to our feature tab, we can make sure that we have a type of on-click being handled here as well, just by saying, okay, anything that's on the div, so we can give it an and of component props without ref of div, and that should allow the on-click handler to be passed through. And then we'll need to go ahead and make sure that the on-click handler is actually passed to this root div by going ahead and saying, okay, we have our tab. We can rename this to props. So I'm going to go ahead and rename this just to make it more obvious what's going on here. We'll change that to props. That doesn't change anything really, but that allows us to go onto our root div and say on-click equals props.onClick in case we pass an on-click handler in, which of course in this case we definitely are passing an on-click handler in. So every time we click this, we should be able to set the selected tab to the current tab index. And then we're going to also pass it a selected attribute. So we're going to say selected equals whether the selected tab is equal to the tab index. Now, of course, this is a proper also not passing in, so we need to make sure we're passing that in as well onto our tab itself. So let's find that feature tab. We'll say props. We've got that type of tabs and this, and we're also going to be passing it a selected, and that's going to be equal to a Boolean. If that selected tab gets passed in, then we'll need to handle that selected prop as well. So we're going to come down here and we're basically just going to say, okay, if we have that props.selected, then we're going to show this motion div border. So let's go ahead and cut that and paste that into here. And let's see if that shows on our selected tab. Okay, so now we have our first tab selected. The only thing we need to do is if we need to click the next one and see if it selects the next one. And indeed, it does. The only thing I want to do, because it's going to keep it in the same position the entire time, is I want to reset it to 0 when the next tab gets selected. And all we need to do that is say that this use effect gets added every time selected changes. So the selected is going to change, or sorry, props.selected, every time that changes, we're going to say if not tabref.current or not props.selected. If it's not selected, go ahead and just return right out of here. And then if it is selected, let's go ahead and set our motion values to 0. So let's say set or x percentage.set 0 and y percentage.set 0. That'll be sure that it sets it back to 0 every single time this restarts. So I'm gonna click this one, it sets it back to 0. Click the next one, sets it back to 0. And so we're starting that at the same position every single time. So I definitely like that a lot better. We're getting our hover animations. So these tabs are starting to look really, really nice. Now, the last thing we want to do in our features section is animate our product image based on the tab that's selected, because right now we can click through these tabs. We can see that the styles on the tabs change, but of course the image doesn't change. So we want to be able to animate this image. We want it to go to different parts of the image and display different parts of it and animate between those states. So in order to do that, we'll change our div that has our background image to a motion.div, and that will allow us to use motion values with that motion div. Now we have a couple of properties inside of each of our tabs. So when the first tab is selected, the background position X and Y should be 0, and the background size X should be 150. And then we have some other background positions created right here. And for the third tab, we also have them as well. So we can use those keys inside of our features section to say that if we have a specific tab selected, then we should be translating to that particular background size and of course background position. So let's go ahead and add a couple of motion values to represent those. So I'm going to say const background position X is going to be equal to use motion value, and that motion value that it starts with is going to be equal to tabs 0 dot background position X. Same thing for our background position Y. So const background position Y is going to be equal to use motion value, and that's going to be tabs 0 dot background position Y. And then we have a background size X. So we're going to say const background size X is going to be equal to use motion value. It's going to be tabs 0 dot background size X as well. Now, because these are going to be represented in percentages, we can't just use the motion values directly. We actually have to turn them into templates. So we're going to have a background position and a background size template that we're going to have to create as well. So I'm going to say const background size, and that's going to be equal to use motion template, and it's going to take in a background size X. So background size X percentage and then auto, that's going to be background size. And for background position, we can say that it is going to be equal to use motion template, and that template is going to be background position X percentage and background position Y percentage. Now we can try this out before we get into actually changing these by just dropping these into our motion div. So for our style, we'll say that our background position is going to be equal to the background position that we just set here. And of course we can use the syntax that just has it written like that. And then same thing for background size. We can say background size, and that's going to be equal to the background size that we already set above it as well. So as soon as I save this, we should see this product image change a little bit. It should zoom in. So let's see if we save that. And yes, indeed, we do see that it zooms in. Now, of course, this is great, but of course, we're not yet animating these values either. So I can still click through and I'm still seeing just the first tab's values. And even if we were to update these motion values directly on this style, that wouldn't animate them either. We need to actually use an animate function whenever we change our tabs to animate our background position and our background size. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to have a handler for when we select a tab. So I'm going to say const handle select tab, and it's going to take in an index, and then it's going to go ahead and do some things. That index is going to be a number, by the way. That should make TypeScript happy. And then on click, instead of doing this down here, I'm just going to say handle select tab. Now when I handle select tab, what I'm going to do is I'm going to set up my selected tab like I did before to my index. And actually we're going to go ahead and do this so we actually can use it. So tab index, so that we can pass through that index. The index is going to be a number. We're going to set our selected tab to that index. And now we're also going to animate our background size and positions as well. So first we're going to animate our background size X. So I'm going to say animate using the same animate function we had before. We're going to animate the background size X. We're going to go through 3 different values. So we're going to go from the original background size X, what it already is. So we're going to get the current value. We're going to go to 100%, and then we're going to find the tab that has the current index, and we're going to get its background size X. So we're going to go from the current to 100%, and then to the new tab background size X size. And we're going to do all of that over a duration of 2 seconds and an ease of ease in out. Okay, so that should animate the background size. Now we have to add in the background position X and background position Y. Before we do that, let's just go ahead and make sure that it works. I'm going to save it, and I'm going to go here and see if the background size changes at all. And you can see that indeed it is changing some, which means that we do have something working for our background size X animation. So that's encouraging, and that means that we can move on to our background position X and Y. So we're going to do the same thing here, essentially animate background position X, and we're going to go from the current background position X.get, and then we're going to go to the new tabs index.background position X, and we're going to do it in the same duration of 2 seconds and ease of ease in out. That should do that. And of course we can go ahead and set our options as a constant so we don't have to keep typing those over and over. So I'm going to say const animate options is going to be equal to one of these. And if we give it the same TypeScript type that we had above, it should also go ahead and make it happy when we try and add it to one of our function calls. So I'm going to give it that same TypeScript type, and I'm going to say animate options, and hopefully that will make it happy. And then I'm going to say the same thing here. We're going to say animate options, and that just keeps us from repeating the same duration and ease. Or if we change it in one place, we want these all to coordinate over the same duration and over the same easing. So that makes it very easy to change this once if we ever need to change this, and it's going to happen for all of them. And then the third one is going to be animating the background position Y. And we're going to animate this from our current background position Y to the new tabs index.background position Y. And that should do the trick. And of course we want to do it over the same animate options, and that should allow it to do it over the same 2 seconds with the same easing rule. So now that we save that, let's go ahead and try and click a couple of these and see how it works. And as you can see, yes, it takes us to the part of the image that is represented by the feature that we're trying to show. So as we go to Smart Keyword Generator, it's going to go over to keywords. As we go to dashboard, it's going to go over to the start of the dashboard, and optimization is going to go down to traffic. So this is a really cool way to be able to take one image and actually get some more value out of it and create a great interaction, a great smooth interaction that isn't jarring for a user and looks really great. I'm really happy with where this is at right now, but let's go ahead, as we like to do, and go ahead and put it into horizontal mode so we can see all the different mobile responsive views and see how they look with the animations added for the feature section. So let's go ahead and see up here we have our features here, so we can click through these on mobile, and it's actually duplicating my click across all the screens, which is really an incredible feature of this Polypane browser. Let me see how this works over here on tablet. Looks great. And then of course on desktop, where it's most impressive, we can click through these different tabs, and of course it's going to show that great large image there for this feature section. So this is looking great. The animations are really outstanding. I really like how this particular section turned out. It's time to work on the next section. Now that we have the animations for our feature section working, let's go ahead and scroll down to our testimonials and talk about what we're going to do in this particular section. And I think we're going to go ahead and scroll everything to the right. So we have some scrolling animations up here. We have our stars that are going to the right. We have logos that are going to the right. We have this that's going to the right. I think we're also going to scroll our animations to the right, which means that we're going to use a very similar effect to what we're doing in our logo ticker in order to make this work. So let's go ahead and go into our testimonials.tsx and chat through what we'll need to do in order to make this happen. The first thing that we're going to need to do is we're going to need to go ahead and duplicate our testimonials. So instead of just saying testimonials.map, we'd like to have 2 times the normal testimonials. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to wrap my testimonials in an array, and then I'm going to use the spread operator to essentially spread the current testimonials twice. So essentially we're going to have 2 times the testimonials if I just spread the testimonials twice into a single array. That just makes it very easy for us to go ahead and create 2 times the testimonials in one array, and we can leave the rest of our code the same for now, which is exactly what we want in this particular case. The other thing we need to do is we need to make sure that our flex wrapper is labeled as flex none so that it expands to be the size of the included testimonials instead of just the size of the parent. And of course, that means that we have to flex the wrapper above it to ensure that it gets the right size as well. So this is going to be the one that's going to hide everything or mask the testimonials. And then of course, inside of here, this will be the one that contains all the testimonials, and this will be the one that gets translated. Now that we have that set up, let's go ahead and import our motion from Framer Motion. So I'm going to import motion from Framer Motion. We're going to make sure that we use client so that we don't wind up with the error that we see when we try to import a Framer Motion div. And then we're going to go ahead and change this, the wrapping flex div, into a motion.div. And I'm going to go ahead and do the same thing down here and motion.div, and that should turn that into a motion div that we can then add props to animate it. Now, like the logo ticker, we want to go from a translate X of -50% to a translate X of 0. And if it works properly, when we say translate X -50%, this first testimonial should be in the same exact spot as if we said translate X 0. So let's go ahead and see what that does. So we can say negative translate X 1/2 or 50% in Tailwind. Okay, and we see a little bit of a shift, and that's due to the padding that we don't currently have. So I'm going to say PR5, and let's see if that does the trick. Okay, so it looks like that's right. So let me go ahead and take this off, and then we'll save. And it looks like it stays in the same spot, and let me add it back on just by doing a Command Z or an undo. And then it looks like after we save, it stays in the exact same spot again. So this looks like it's working how we want it to, which means we could start to animate that motion. So our initial prop is going to be initial, and that's going to be translate X of -50%. And then our animate is going to be what it animates to, and that's going to be translate X of 0. And let me see if there's anything else we need to add to that. I'm not seeing anything right offhand. Of course, it's going to be a very quick animation once we refresh our page. Let's go ahead and refresh our page and just see. Yeah, it's a very quick animation. So we need to use the transition prop to control that animation. So the transition is going to be, of course, repeat infinity. We're going to want the ease to be linear, and we're going to want the duration. Let's just start out with 30 seconds and see how that looks. So I'm going to save that and then refresh the page, and let's see what we see as far as that goes. So we're seeing our testimonials are coming from the left. They're going to the right. We should go through 4 different testimonials before it starts over. Of course, we can add as many as we want, but we have 4 as part of our testimonials, and then it should start over, but it should appear that it's an infinite repeat. So we're getting to the last one, this last one before we come back to the first one. So if this happens properly, we shouldn't see any jump. We shouldn't see anything except for it just start over again, which is exactly what happened. So this looks perfect right now. This was a pretty simple, easy to implement change with our motion div, but of course, let's go through each of our views and ensure that it looks good on all of our responsive views. So I'm going to go ahead and pull out my browser as far as I can, and then I'm going to go to the horizontal view, and let's see what happens when we scroll down to that testimonials section. So on mobile, it's looking good. We're seeing our testimonial come in. We can read it, of course. And then on tablet, it's looking great. We see this testimonial scrolling over. And then on desktop, we can see 2.5 testimonials at a time. So that's looking great as well. But of course, that's all exactly like we want it to look. It's just a smooth, great interaction that's once again leveling up our page and making it look better, more eye-catching, and more polished. Now that we're done with that, let's go ahead and head down to the call to action and animate the last part of this landing page. Now that we've taken care of our testimonial interaction, let's go ahead and scroll down to the call to action. This is the last section of the page that we're going to add animation to. So let's go ahead and open up our call to action, and then we're going to see the different ways that we can add animation to this. The first thing that I'd like to do is I'd like to go ahead and give the stars in this section a parallax effect as well, because I really liked the parallax effect that we added to the hero section with the stars. It just gave it kind of a deep feeling. Instead of just being up on the screen, you kind of almost see the stars in the distance. So if we do the same thing here, then we should be able to get the same kind of effect. So we would like to go ahead and use the scroll position of our call to action in order to give us a good parallax effect for our star. So the first thing we're going to do is come up here and say use client. That's going to make this a client component. We're also going to import motion from Framer motion, and we're going to use the scroll, and we're going to have to give whatever DOM element we want to listen to a ref in order to be able to track the scroll position of that. So I'm going to say const section ref, and that's going to be equal to use ref from React. It's going to have a default value of null, and it can just be HTML section. HTML element might do the trick there as far as the TypeScript type of that goes. And then we'll go ahead and say the ref is going to be equal to section ref. So that doesn't really change anything. That just allows us to get this DOM HTML element and pass it to our use scroll hook when we add it to the page. So I'm going to say use scroll, and we're going to give it options of the target, which is the section ref. And our offset is going to be when the start of that call to action container gets to the end of the page until the end of the call to action container gets to the start of the page. So we use that quite commonly when we use that. And then we're going to say const scroll y progress is what the value that we're going to get from the use scroll hook. So we have that scroll y progress value. We know based on our hero interaction that this is going to be a value between 0 and 1. So we're going to want to transform it to a value that makes more sense for changing the Y position of our background. So we'll go ahead and use the use transform hook from Framer Motion as well in order to say that when the scroll Y progress changes, we want to transform that from, instead of 0 to 1, we're going to go from negative 300 to 300, which is exactly what we used in the hero, and that worked out really well. Once we've gotten it to that value, that's going to represent the background position Y, if I'm not mistaken. So I'm going to say const background position Y is equal to that use transform. And then we can change this to a motion.div. So I'm going to say motion.div here, and then change the other ending div to a motion.div as well. And then we should be able to, in our style, go ahead and say background position Y, and hopefully that will add that in correctly. So let's see if that actually does work. And let's go ahead and scroll, and we do see that we can see that that position is definitely changing, and it looks like it has much more depth, which is really, really nice. It's just a really nice effect. It's very subtle, but it definitely is one of the nicer effects. The second thing we'd like to do to our stars is make sure that they're animating to the right like our hero stars are. And in order to do that, all we need to do is add an animate prop to our motion.div as well. And we can set our background position X to our stars bg.width. So it will animate to that background position X, which is going to move those to the right. And then we just need to set the transition prop to say how long this takes and how it repeats, the easing, all of that. So I'm going to say repeat infinity. Duration is going to be 60 and ease is going to be linear. And let's see how that looks as we look at our stars. And we can see that they are animating from left to right. It's not a super fast transition. And then of course, we're also keeping our parallax. So even though they're animating, we still keep our up and down Y direction parallax as well. So that's a really clean, really smooth animation right there. Now that we have these parallax animated stars in our background of the call to action section, the last thing we want to do is animate this mask image so that this little background gradient that's behind our title actually moves around if the mouse is in the section, and then returns to the spot if the mouse is out of the section. So I'll show you how we walk through doing that here right now. So let's go ahead and look at what we have. This right here is where this grid lines is coming from. Of course, we have our radial gradient that's being shown here. And essentially what I think I'm going to do is I think we're going to duplicate this div. And one of them is going to follow the mouse position and show when that div is hovered. And the other one is only going to show when it's not. So it's going to return to its normal state when it's not hovered, and then when it is, it's going to show the other one. So let's go ahead and just duplicate this div. I'm just going to do a Command-C, Command-V here. So we have two of these grid lines div. Of course, now it's extra bold. And what we're going to do is we're going to say when this motion div that has the border is hovered, we're actually going to go ahead and give it a group class. Now, group enables us to change other divs inside of it based on the actions that happen on this particular motion div. This isn't specific to Framer Motion. This is actually specific to Tailwind CSS. So if we have that group, then we can hide and show these based on when that group is hovered or not. So the first one I'm going to say that is shown, and when the group is hovered, we're going to hide it by setting the opacity to 0. So that's the first one. And then the second one is going to be opacity 0 by default. And then when the group is hovered, we're going to show it by saying opacity 100. So we have one showing one time when the group is not hovered. We have the other one showing when the group is hovered. Of course, you're not going to see any difference because they're both exactly the same right now. So what we can do is we can go ahead and add a little bit of transition as well, but we'll get to that after we can actually see the difference between one or the other, because of course, one is going to follow the mouse position and then one is going to be default at 50%, 35%. And so just to be able to see the difference between them right now, I'm gonna go ahead and set this one to 0 pixels, 0 pixels, and then we should see a difference when we hover. We should see that one come in. So you see that there's two different ones right here, and it's kind of a jarring effect right now. So I'm going to set a little bit of a transition here. So I'm going to say transition, and I'm going to say duration 700. That's going to be 700 milliseconds for that transition to happen, just to make it nice and smooth. So say duration 700 on this one as well. And then we should see a smooth transition once we refresh the page and then hover this between one or the other. So you can see there's that nice smooth transition as we hover on the page. Now, of course, this second one is the one that we're actually going to want to animate with our motion values. So we're going to turn this into a motion div. So let me go ahead and do that. Say it's motion.div. That should turn that into a motion div. And then of course, for our style, we're going to style the mask image and we're going to give it a value here. So I'm going to actually remove that for now because I'm going to need to turn that into a template and use some motion values in order to do that. So I'm going to go ahead and remove this mask image right here. And I'm going to bring that up into my component. And I'm just going to say use motion template for this. So say use motion template, and that should allow me to go ahead and use this as a template. So radial gradient, let's say 50%, 50% at, and then we're going to give it an X and Y value, and of course black, and then transparent. So all that looks like right now, it's working fine. Of course, we're not tracking the mouse position yet. So let's go ahead and figure out how we're going to track our mouse position. What I think I'm going to do is I think I'm going to create a custom hook. Now, a custom hook is great because it encapsulates business logic and allows us to reuse this. Now, we're only going to use it once. So what I'm going to do is create that custom hook. So what we're going to do is come outside of our call to action component, and we're going to say const use relative mouse position because we want to get the relative mouse position to what we're hovering. And we're going to take a ref, sort of like the use scroll hook takes a target ref. We're going to take a ref. So that's going to be a ref object with an HTML element, just so that TypeScript understands what's going on. Let me make sure I'm bringing in that ref object there. And then we're going to have a couple of motion values. So const mouse x is going to be equal to use motion value 0. And then const mouse y is equal to use motion value of 0 as well. And then we're going to return mouse x and mouse y as an array. So we have a custom hook here, use relative mouse position. We haven't actually gotten the mouse position. All we've done so far is just set some motion values and returned those motion values here. And then inside of our call to action, we can use those by saying const mouse x and mouse y is equal to use relative mouse position. And we need to give it a ref to track the relative mouse position too. So let's go ahead and do that. That ref is going to be equal to this bordered div right here. And for lack of a better word, I guess we could just use bordered div because in what we were talking about, const bordered div ref is equal to use ref. That'll be an HTML element with a default value of null. And then I'm just going to add that here. So ref equals bordered div ref. Oh yeah, we need HTML div element here to make TypeScript happy. And that will allow us to have our ref that we can pass into our use relative mouse position. So now I can say bordered div ref, and hopefully TypeScript will be happy with what we've just done. Looks like it is. And that allows us to get our mouse X and mouse Y. Now, of course, once again, we haven't gotten the actual values for these yet. We're not actually tracking the mouse yet. We're just hooking up the custom hook. So I'm getting a mouse X and mouse Y position, and then we're just going to manually drop these into our motion template. So I'm going to say mouse X here and mouse Y here. So this is just all kind of the plumbing to get this to work. Now let's go ahead and figure out how to track our mouse position. It's not actually that hard. We just need to add a use effect so that we can add an event listener to the default native JavaScript mouse move event. So use effect will allow us to add that event listener, and we're going to instantiate that whenever we instantiate our hook. And then we need to say window.add event listener, and we're going to listen to the mouse move event. And whenever that happens, we want to run a particular function. Now we don't have a function to run yet, so let me go ahead and create that function. I'm going to call that function const update mouse position. That's just going to be equal to a function. And then we can say every time the mouse moves, we want to run the update mouse position function like so. And then if this hook gets taken away, we'll return a function that runs that basically removes this event listener. So we're just going to say window.remove event listener for mouse move, and it's going to have taken that same function name, update mouse position. When this mouse move function runs, it's going to pass a mouse event to this function right here. So my event that I get right here is going to be a mouse event, and it's going to include the current position of the mouse. So that's really helpful for us because it's exactly what we need in this case. The other thing we need inside of this update mouse position function is we need the size and location of our current to object. Whatever we're getting our relative position to, we need the location of that as well and the size of that. So we can get that with a get bounding client rect call. So I'm going to say const rect equals to.current .get bounding client rect, and that should give us a left and top value, and that will help us to get these relative values. And since we always want to make sure that it's actually there, what we'll do is we'll just not say that this might be undefined. In fact, if it is undefined, if we don't have that value, if we don't have not to.current, then we'll just go ahead and return, and we just won't do anything right there. So that means that this is always going to be there. That rectangle is going to include a top value and a left value, and then we can set our mouse X position to our mouse event dot X minus our rectangle dot left, or sorry, minus left, and then mouse X dot set is what I meant to say there, and then mouse Y is going to be set to our event dot Y minus our top value of our object. So essentially, if this object were 100 pixels down the screen and my mouse right here were 100 pixels down the screen, the Y value would be 0 because it's going to be at the top of our div that we're tracking, our relative mouse position. So that's what we want to get here, and that's what we're setting is our relative mouse position inside of whatever ref, whatever HTML element that we are tracking. So now that we have this use relative mouse position in a good spot, that means we can start to use it down here. And it looks like we already have this all hooked up. So this might actually work exactly as is. Let me go ahead and save this and see what we get when we start to track in here. Okay, so the problem right now is that we are getting our motion template, but we aren't actually assigning it to our motion div right here. So essentially we just don't have an image mask on this div, and so when this shows up without the image mask at all, it's just showing up as the totality of the div itself. So what we need to do is say const image mask is equal to this use motion template with our used relative mouse X and Y values. So I'm going to bring this image mask down here, and I'm going to insert it into here. So we're going to say image mask is equal to our image mask value, or excuse me, mask image is what I meant to say. So mask image is equal to our mask image value. I'm going to change this to mask image as well. And then we should be actually tracking this at the position of the mouse. So let's see and make sure that that's actually happening. So as our mouse goes over the page, now we see that as our mouse moves around, because we're getting the relative position and we're updating our image mask based on that relative position, that's allowing us to show this gradient moving around with our mouse. And then as soon as our mouse goes away, then we show the default one, which is showing behind the title. That's a great effect. It's definitely something that will catch eyes. It's definitely something that will impress. And it's something that just gives an extra level of polish and class to this AI startup landing page. The last thing we need to do on this page is just make sure that everything looks good at every single responsive value. So I'm going to pull this out once again, go to my horizontal view and just look at everything we've accomplished. So the first thing we did is we went ahead and made sure that our hero had these awesome spinning electron looking things around our planet. We also have a parallax effect on our stars, and our stars are moving. So all those three effects are part of our hero. Moving down to our logo ticker, we can see that our logos are showing all the way through. They have an infinite scroll effect that's going on our logos. And down in our features section, we see that the currently selected tab is showing. We also have this great icon animation effect that we brought in with Lottie. So we've integrated that. And if we click on one of these tabs, we can see that our image changes by going to a different part of the image. That's just a great effect, especially on the desktop where you can see that image in full view. And then down in testimonials, we have another infinite scroll effect to show testimonials and make it look like we just have tons and tons of testimonials, which is a great effect for any marketing site. And then down here in the call to action, we once again have parallax, we have the stars, and we have that great mouse relative position effect following our mouse around as we move. So that finishes up all the animations for this page. This page looks spectacular, and this is definitely sure to impress. I hope you enjoyed this project, and I hope to see you back here for another video. Thanks for watching.